Crossing the Darkness. Chapter 1. Faith Cadena cried out in agony, her voice echoing inside the antiseptic hospital room. She clenched her teeth, tasting sweat as it poured down her face. Her legs were open wide and raised, her bulging belly obscuring her direct line of sight. Lights flashed above her in a blinding blur. She caught whirling glimpses of computer monitors to her left, mysterious devices of medical science designed to measure her life signs. Phosphorescent green lines spiked erratically. A doctor wearing a surgical mask sat hunched between her legs, anticipating the arrival of new life. The searing, building pain wasn't like anything Faith had ever experienced before in her 18 years, and that was saying something. She had already faced a lifetime's worth of adversity and suffering. She twisted her lips into a manic grin. This was a good pain, she told herself. This wasn't the pain of an abusive stepfather stubbing out a burning hot cigarette butt into your arm, or the numbing throb of a broken heart after catching another loser boyfriend cheating. The pain tearing her insides out was different because it filled her with hope. After all the screw-ups and wrong moves and bad mistakes, she finally had done something good with her life, something she could be proud of. She grimaced and her jaws tightened with the final effort. She exhaled a sharp gasp of unbridled anguish, and the wails of a newborn filled the room. Everyone relaxed. Faith could see the tension easing from the medical staff. She sensed that they were smiling under those surgical masks. Her baby was alive and well. The doctor wrapped the screaming infant in a blanket and handed it to one of the nurses. The physical contact seemed to calm the baby down a little. Faith weakly turned her head, straining to catch a closer look at her child. Her eyes found the newborn, and the steel inside her grew brittle. She had learned from a young age to keep her emotions in check. Emotions could be exploited as a weakness and used against you. A smile had to be earned, never given freely. But the innocent, helpless bundle before her broke down all defenses. Tears welled up and her lips quivered into a smile of pure joy. She didn't care whether it was a boy or a girl, didn't wonder what she should call the child. Those were questions for another day. Right now, what mattered the most was her overpowering need to hold her own baby, to feel that trembling ball of life next to her. She struggled to speak and was shocked at how weak her quavering voice sounded. "Can I hold her?" The question hung in the air, greeted by a moment of inaction. There was doubt in the nurse's eyes, duty at war with her own feminine nature. The nurse took a tentative step toward Faith when the doctor appeared. He looked down at Faith, and there was resigned sympathy in his gaze. "I'm sorry. You're not allowed contact with the baby." The baby, not your baby. She had given life to this child, but according to the state, she would be granted no further rights over her own daughter. Her body had been nothing more than a means to an end, a biological incubator denied its own creation. A door zoomed open and men wearing black-gray uniforms appeared. Faith's breath hitched and her heart seemed to trip over its own beat. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. A perfect moment had degenerated into a nightmare. "No." Almost as if the newborn knew it was about to be separated from its mother, the baby started to scream again. Agonizing seconds stretched as the uniformed men snatched the child. Faith stirred. Despite what she'd been through, she had to take action. Tapping into her last reserves of strength, she pushed herself out of bed. When her naked feet hit the icy floor, they left a trail of blood in their wake. The nurse and doctor tried to stop her, but they shrank away, scared by her intensity. A dark fire burned inside of her, a primal instinct honed by thousands of years of human evolution. She managed to take a few weak steps before the exertion took its inevitable toll. Her legs gave out and she crumpled, head hitting the freezing tile with a dull smack. She wrenched her neck and looked up through a cloud of tears. Her words shook the room with maternal anguish as the uniformed kidnappers vanished through the door. The world slipped out of focus, growing fuzzy around the edges. "Please, Don't let them take my baby. Please. Faith's eyes snapped open. Her body spasmed and her lungs inhaled sharply. The scene in the hospital room had been a dream, an old memory hungry for attention. She was not sprawled on the hospital floor any longer, but instead found herself suspended upright inside a metal-reinforced glass cylinder. A tangled mass of tubes extended from her body like artificial umbilical cords. She was naked except for a tank top and shorts. Her hands came up and she realized there wasn't enough room to shift her position. Groggy and doing her best to shake off her confusion, she stared through the glass lid of her high-tech coffin at the world beyond. The glass distorted her view and she could barely make out a cavernous maze of metal and glass and shadows. Where was she? What was going on? A growing physical discomfort put a halt to her questions. Each breath had become an ordeal and she gasped for air. Inside the chamber, oxygen levels must have dropped below an acceptable level. Her arms twisted in the confined space and she pushed her hands against the cylinder's glass surface, pressing. A fierce struggle ensued but yielded little result. The tube didn't budge. How was she going to get out of this contraption? Claustrophobia took hold, control threatening to slip away once more. She started pounding the glass. Her parched mouth couldn't form the words echoing through her mind. Let me out of here! Her moment of sheer terror was mercifully cut short. There was a sudden explosion of escaping gas and the lid of the cryotube slid open with a hiss. The cables popped off her body and retracted into the wall of the cryochamber. Faith stumbled out of the open glass cylinder and collapsed on her knees. She greedily sucked in air. As the oxygen revitalized her, she hazarded a look at the now empty cryotube and realized it was just one out of many such tubes. The room was filled with hundreds of identical glass cylinders, each containing the silhouettes of men and women. The sight brought further clarity to her jumbled thoughts, snapping her memory into sharp focus. 10 years had passed since she gave birth to her daughter. She wasn't on Earth anymore, but aboard the Orion, a colony barge headed for the main belt asteroids, a 134 million mile, 1-year journey. She had chosen to leave everything she knew behind to start a new life in the outer colonies. Paul, the young man she'd dated for what seemed like a minute before she decided to sign up with the mining corporation, had frowned at her when she first brought up the idea of moving to the asteroid belt. Why would anyone take a chance on a rock millions of miles away from home? The answer was clear to her, even if Paul might not appreciate it. Maybe home had nothing to offer them. Faith stood in the dark for another moment, eyes adjusting to the subdued lighting, reassured by her growing understanding of her situation. Taking in the maze of sleeping colonists around her, she couldn't help but wonder why she was awake. The most likely explanation was a timer issue with her capsule. The grim alternative was an onboard emergency of some kind. But if that were the case, wouldn't every one of the 4,000 passengers on the Orion be awake by now? Her premature return to consciousness had to be a glitch, and glitches could be fixed. As far as Faith was aware, the ship was run by a skeleton crew, the captain and about 15 other essential personnel, while most of the colonists remained in deep hibernation. All she had to do was locate an intercom system, put in a call to the bridge and let them know what was going on. With any luck, they'd be nice enough to tuck her back in and let her catch up on her beauty sleep for the remainder of their journey. Surprisingly, the gray, sterile environment of the Orion seemed more appealing than another cryosleep cycle. She wasn't quite ready to face the nightmares of her past again so soon. Faith staggered erect, her legs straining under the weight of her own body. The cryotube was supposed to electrically stimulate her muscles and assure they wouldn't atrophy, but she could tell she hadn't used her legs in quite some time. With each step, it seemed like someone was driving sharp nails into her calves and thighs. She caught a reflection in one of the cryotubes, and for a moment, her features seemed superimposed over the dormant person inside the cylinder. She didn't like what she was seeing. She must have lost about 10 pounds since she slipped into the tube, the bones of her face outlined sharply under the skin. She looked gaunt and haunted, the mileage catching up with her beauty. She was only 29, but the last decade hadn't been a cakewalk. Her attention shifted from her face to the tattoos that shimmered over her body, a mixture of strange glyphs and numbers. They flickered and kept changing shape as she flexed her muscles. Each tattoo contained a series of 3 digital images that were randomly projected under her skin, souvenirs of her own rough past. For a moment, she marveled at the images, a fierce dragon becoming a Chinese symbol of peace, only to make way for a police badge with a waxy death's head at its center. Images that once meant so much to her, but now didn't seem to belong on her body. Time had made them lose their meaning. Faith kept walking. Her footsteps echoed through the vast cavernous chamber. The only other sound was the incessant thrumming of hyperdrive engines beneath her bare feet, the spaceship's faint yet steady heartbeat. She tried not to stare at the walls of dormant people as she passed them. Even though these space travelers were asleep and not dead, she couldn't shake the feeling of being inside a giant mausoleum. Surrounded by hundreds of people, yet utterly alone, she felt a crushing, almost paralyzing sense of loneliness descend over her. The colonists looked like ghosts trapped in icy limbo. Faith realized she had been one of them only minutes earlier, and a shiver crawled up her spine. Cryostasis might be the cheapest way to space travel, but it sure as hell wasn't her favorite way. Faith approached a door in the bulkhead. It whooshed open, sensors responding to her presence. She stepped into the adjoining chamber that was dominated by an observation window and stole a glance outside. For a moment she could only stare, overwhelmed by the sight that awaited her. To behold the infinity of glittering stars was to experience both awe and fear. The darkness of deep space loomed, a perfect void. In her mind's eye she could picture the Orion, 1,000,000 tons of titanium gliding through the vast nothingness beyond the observation window. Nuclear thrusters the size of football fields roaring like incandescent, plasma-powered miniature suns. They were a long way from their final destination, and, once again, Faith wondered why she was awake. Gripped by a growing sense of foreboding, she suddenly wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Chapter 2. Faith stumbled into a shower area. Sensors registered her presence, and steaming water engulfed her. She sighed, her body responding to the hot steam with pleasure. She basked in the sensation, the water streaming down her form, washing away the residue of the various cryo gases. After 10 minutes, she felt dizzy and instructed the computer to kill the furious spray. She stumbled out of the shower, and a blast of hot air enveloped her body and hair. Still a bit groggy, but sporting a happy, satisfied smile, she approached a giant wall of lockers. Her personal belongings were kept in one of them. Faith Cadena. One of the lockers snapped open. Her utilitarian mining tech uniform was waiting for her. Faith got dressed. Before she closed the locker, she reached inside and found a small metallic disc. She studied the object with deep emotion before tapping it. A hologram flickered to life that showed a little girl playing with a ragged doll. The child was laughing, full of life and joy, the image of a daughter she had never held in her arms, an image so pure and sweet that it broke Faith's heart. Tears welled in her eyes, and she smiled wistfully. She tapped the hollow image, and the little girl vanished into thin air. Faith pulled out a pack of cigarettes from another pocket and lit up. She inhaled deeply, smoke wafting around her head. The smoke singed the lining of her throat, and after months without a fix, she could feel a cough building in her chest. Nevertheless, a crooked smile curled her lips. God, she needed that. Faith finished her cigarette and stepped up to the comm system. She mouthed her first words in months. "Cryodeck, to bridge. Can anyone hear me up there?" Her words were greeted by crackling static. "Someone must be flying this ship. Hello?" No answer. Frustrated and increasingly disturbed, Faith shook her head. Great. She had no choice but to head for the nearest elevator. Faith stepped into the lift, doors whooshing shut behind her. She selected the upper habitat deck as her destination. The elevator hummed to life and ascended. Faith was unnerved and fought back a sense of growing anxiety. By now, the computer should have alerted the crew that one of their passengers was awake. What the hell was going on? The elevator stopped and the doors opened. To Faith's surprise, she was greeted by moaning and gasps of pleasure, almost as if someone was having sex outside the elevator. Her curiosity grew. Gingerly, Faith stepped out of the lift. Guard up, she made her way through the dark, deserted comm room. The source of moaning became apparent. Hollow porn filled the room. A three-dimensional couple flitted over the couches and armchairs. There was no audience for the shimmering images of furious copulation. Besides Faith and the energetic hollow couple, there was no sign of a living presence. Mildly amused, Faith passed through the hologram, the couple dancing over her body to become, ever so briefly, a virtual threesome. She studied the room. A table was littered with a few half-empty beer bottles, more evidence of a stag party interrupted. 15 men stuck in a hunk of metal for 10 long months without female companionship had to find a way to blow off steam somehow. Further inspection revealed overturned furniture, and Faith spotted a few broken bottles scattered across the carpeted floor. A chilling thought occurred to her. Could these be signs of a struggle of some kind? Faith had seen enough violence in her life to recognize its stark signature. Her gaze stopped dead at a nearby couch, and she was hit by a rush of anxiety. The couch was stained black. There was no doubt in her mind she was looking at dried blood. It had seeped into the furniture and the carpeted floor. Apprehension choked her. Faith stumbled toward the nearest exit, fighting back a sense of mounting paranoia. She arrived in a sterile corridor lined with doors, the skeleton crew's living quarters. As she headed down the hallway, she couldn't shake the disquieting sense that someone was tracking her every move. The silence was unnerving. Her muffled footsteps were the only sound in the empty corridor. Overhead lights flickered on and off, creating a surreal strobing effect. Faith shot the doors a wary glance before deciding to approach one of them. She hesitated, but then gave herself an internal push and tapped a button. The door whooshed open. Faith stepped into sleeping quarters. Treading lightly, she soaked up the details of the room. It was tiny, cramped, and held 3 unmade bunk beds. A sink overflowed with toiletries. Faith approached the bunk beds, her eyes alert. A few holograms crackled into existence as the bunk sensors registered her approach. The image of a smiling man holding up a 3-year-old appeared in front of the first bunk, while the pin-up of a stunning blonde materialized over the second bunk. Faith wondered whether the image came from a calendar or some lover left 1,000,000 miles behind on Earth. As she shifted her attention to the third bunk, she was greeted with an aerial view of Hawaii taken from space. Faith allowed herself a smile, and she could feel some of the tension leaving her body. She welcomed the various hollow images' mundane nature, their humanity. It meant someone else was around, and she wasn't alone aboard this godforsaken vessel. Faith turned and exited the room, stepping back into the corridor. It was lined with many doors. She guessed they must lead to the other sleeping quarters, but she had seen enough. Instead of checking each room individually, she decided to head straight for the bridge. The desolate corridor was making her anxious. A part of her was tempted to just shout so she could put an end to the oppressive silence. As she brushed past the doors on her side, her gaze focused on the dark hallway ahead. The door behind her opened without warning, and a man lurched out at her. Gurgling blood, he wore a blue mining tech uniform that was now tattooed in red, the handle of a shiver blade protruding from his chest. Faith cried out and recoiled, while a part of her mind, toughened by years of surviving on the unforgiving streets of New Cairo, and further honed by a 9-year stint on the lunar penal colony, was galvanized into action. As the man collapsed, hitting the floor with a wet thud, Faith knelt by him, desperately trying to staunch the bleeding. She was soon covered in blood, overwhelmed by the number of gushing wounds. By the time she turned back to the hapless man's face, his now empty eyes stared into space, dead. Paralyzed for a moment, she just leaned over the corpse. Copper scented the air and made her feel nauseous. A dark, nagging suspicion had just been confirmed in vivid, crimson detail. Something was terribly wrong aboard this ship. It brought another thought. Her being awake might not be a random accident after all. She stole a glance inside the open sleeping quarters from which the dying man had emerged. Despite her fear, Faith entered the quarters. She was greeted by the pungent stench of human decay. Death lurked within the room. She looked across the chamber and was sickened. 3 men were slumped in their bunks, faces bloated and putrefied. Unlike the fellow in the hallway, they had been dead for weeks, if not months. Their maroon uniforms told her that they weren't miners but part of the ship's crew. Faith could feel her heart racing. Her hands came up and covered her nose, protecting her from the worst of the smell. She stifled back the scream building in the back of her throat. Repelled by the grim setting, she was stumbling back when she heard the shuffle of footsteps behind her. "Freeze!" Faith turned around slowly, eyes fixed on the man who was holding a pulse gun at her head. He had a hard face made harder by bleary eyes and a 3-day growth of brown-gray stubble. There was a definite edge to the guy. She flashed him her most charming smile, knowing the unexpected reaction might throw him off for a split second. Without conscious thought being necessary, she snatched the man's wrist, pushing it toward the ceiling as the first laser bullet erupted from the barrel in a rain of sparks. Faith spun around, both hands now anchored on his forearm, and hurled him over her shoulder in one fast, fluid movement. 9 years in prison had taught her a trick or two when it came to personal security. One key lesson had stuck. Never hold back in a fight unless you plan on donating blood. The man slammed into the floor. Faith hovered over the downed stranger with arms up, limbs coiled in a combat stance, body surging with adrenaline. Reacting with trained instincts of his own, the man's foot swept out and knocked Faith right on her ass. She hit the floor, an impact traveling up her spine. Ignoring the pain, prison lesson number 1, never stop moving, she scrambled over the hallway floor to regain her bearings. She pivoted and came face to face with the barrel of a pulse gun, its bore digging into her forehead. The man glared at Faith. "Go ahead. Piss me off," he said. The sober tone in his voice left no doubt. One wrong move and she felt certain that he would pull the trigger. They regarded each other, eyes lingering as they sized each other up. "Put your hands up, now," he ordered, and Faith complied. The man grabbed her, spinning her body around, and pushed her up against the wall. As he expertly frisked her, she knew instantly that he had performed body searches before. That suggested he had a security or law enforcement background. Was this man part of ship security? His uniform suggested otherwise. Based on that, he wasn't part of the crew, but just another colony worker headed for the asteroid mines. For Faith, that raised an interesting question. Did this space traveler just wake up from Cryo 2? Faith scanned the man's name tag. It identified him as Harker. "Listen, I have no idea what's going on here," Faith said. "Shut up!" Harker broke off, having found the metallic hollow disk in one of her pockets. He tapped a button, and the image of the little girl popped into existence. The innocent image of the child struck a sharp contrast to the body splayed against the wall. With the gun leveled at her forehead, Faith fought back the urge to grab the hologram right out of the man's hands. Reason prevailed, and she willed herself to stay calm. The gun was a constant reminder that she wasn't in control here. Harker crouched next to the corpse, his gun remaining locked on Faith. He gently closed the dead man's eyes before he turned his iron gaze on her. "Who the fuck are you?" Faith felt certain that no matter what she told him, Harker wouldn't believe her. Chapter 3. With Harker's gun pressed against Faith's back, they arrived on the command bridge. 6 colonists, 4 men and 2 women, eagerly awaited them. The mining workers who hovered around the various computers and bridge chairs looked lost and scared to Faith. They must have recently woken from deep cryo-sleep and were still shaking off the cobwebs of their long slumber. Judging from their identical uniforms, they were all techs, a fancy designation for grunt work that was both dangerous and mind-numbingly tedious. All of them appeared to be in their mid-20s to early 30s. The mining companies needed workers old enough to commit themselves to a life millions of miles away from the home world, but youthful enough to warrant the steep investment necessary to transport them across the vast darkness of space. Faith had seen reports putting the cost estimate at $5 million per colonist. As Faith took a closer look at her surroundings, she saw that terminals were dark and the lights on various consoles muted. The sorry state of the bridge made her realize that no one was piloting the ship, and she wondered with growing horror whether all members of the crew were gone. The colonists kept studying Faith with unflinching suspicion. "Who are you people?" Faith asked. Where's the crew? Harker's grim expression spoke volumes. There is no crew. The words hit Faith hard. The dead crew members on the habitat deck had made her fear the worst, but she had still clung to the hope she might be wrong. How? Faith asked. I can only speak for the unfortunate souls below. From the looks of it, they were caught off guard. My guess is that someone turned off life support while they were still asleep. You don't think it was an accident? Faith knew how silly the question sounded, how desperate. She added weakly, Who would do such a thing? I was going to ask you the same question. What were you doing on the habitat deck? Faith was speechless, searching for the right place to begin and knowing the hostel room wouldn't accept any explanation but an admission of guilt. Harker took a step closer. According to the computer, we're 100 million miles off course and out of communication range with any known outpost. Faith was gripped by a terrible thought. How long have we been adrift? Computer, please inform our new guest what year it is. The date is March 13th, 2114, the ship's computer said in a neutral, matter-of-fact voice. The revelation stunned Faith. The world tilted. They had left Earth in 2109, which meant the ship had been adrift for 5 years. Half a decade of her life had slipped away while she was slumbering away in a hyperstasis capsule. She knew Harker and the others were studying her reaction, but she didn't care. They would have to be morons not to realize her shock was genuine. How is this possible? Why don't you tell me? Who are you? Faith took a deep breath, relieved to be asked a question she could answer. My name is Faith Kadena, assigned to Mining Tech Unit 5, C rank. What are you doing awake? I could ask you the same question. Faith paused for a second, realizing that being confrontational wasn't going to help her case. She continued. My hypersleep capsule initiated a wake-up sequence 30 minutes ago. I tried to contact the bridge, but no one was answering the comm. I decided to head for the habitat level. Faith broke off. She could feel the hard eyes of the colonists boring into her. All of a sudden, being back asleep in cryo didn't seem so bad. She'd rather confront the nightmares of her past than a hostile reality that, with each passing second, was making less and less sense. For God's sake, ask the computer. You can review the security files. The security system is down and all files have been erased. Faith stared at Harker with big eyes. If someone had tampered with the security system, it indicated foul play or sabotage of some kind. What the hell was happening here? Let me give it to you straight, Harker said. All 8 of us woke from cryo less than 2 hours ago. Peterson, who bled all over your uniform, was with us. A frown furrowed Faith's brow. I don't understand. Once we arrived on the bridge and realized there was no trace of the crew, I asked the computer to scan the ship for other life signs. It found you on the habitat deck. Only you. Harker's unwavering glance locked on Faith. She began to understand why they suspected her of being involved in Peterson's death. No one else was awake besides her. You two headed to the habitat deck to check it out. Faith's voice was dry as she spoke. Peterson foolishly suggested we split up to cover more ground. Harker took a step closer. Now it's your turn to finish the story. I didn't have anything to do with what happened to your friend, I swear. Someone had already stabbed him multiple times. I just woke up from cryo and I have no fucking clue what is going on here. Exasperated, hands trembling, Faith found the animosity in the room was getting to her. Harker eyed Faith, taken aback by the force behind her response. Until I know what the hell's happening here, you're a suspect and a potential accomplice. I ask you again, is there anything you want to get off your chest? Before Faith could respond, one of the colonists said, I just retrieved her file. Get this, the broad was doing hard time on the lunar penal colony. Faith stared at the speaker. His name tag identified him as Gilardi. He appeared to be in his mid-20s. His baby face seemed like it had never known the touch of a razor, and his eyes held no warmth. So you're an ex-con, Harker said. When were you going to share this part of your resume with us? It's in the past. Really? How many years were you in for? There was a brief moment of hesitation before Faith answered. Too many. What did you do? Nothing I'm proud of. You've got to give me more than that. I was 18 and ran with the wrong crowd. I messed up. Not a day goes by where I don't wish I could go back and do things differently. I bet that's why you got those tattoos, to show the world how upset you were. Faith reacted as if she'd been slapped. Harker was talking about the police badge skull tattoo visible on her wrist. A white skull indicated that a cop had taken a shot at a perp. A black skull designated a kill. Both images commanded respect to varying degrees. Faith's skull was white. It buys you some status when you're doing hard time. I bet it does. Other inmates look at you differently. It keeps you alive. You do what you have to when you think you'll never breathe fresh air again. Faith's voice grew heavy with emotion. I did my time. All I want now is to move on with my life. So you signed up for a colony run. That's right. Not too many prospects for ex-cons back on Earth. I just needed a fresh start, Faith said in a tight voice, her eyes locked on Harker. Last time I checked, no one signs up for a run in the asteroid mines if they're squeaky clean. She stared daggers at the colonists. One of the mining techs approached Harker. The man was about 6'2", with an athletic frame and rugged good looks framed by a mop of shaggy brown hair. He seemed too handsome to spend his 20s mining asteroids. Under different circumstances, Faith might have found him attractive. The name tag on his chest identified him as Angus. I think she's telling the truth, he said. She doesn't strike me as someone who could take out a whole crew or knife a man. Angus's eyes remained fixed on Faith, and she felt relief. At least one person was willing to stand up for her. She met Harker's probing gaze. I swear, I had nothing to do with this. Don't trust her. A bland, bird-like female colonist by the name of Michelle interjected, her voice unable to hide her panic. Harker raised his weapon and approached Faith. I don't have time to sort you out right now. What are you going to do? Harker's answer was both swift and eloquent. He pointed the tip of his weapon at her. With the barrel of the gun trained on her head, Harker escorted Faith off the bridge. He directed her down a nearby corridor that dead-ended in a holding cell. Harker waved his gun, indicating for Faith to step into the waiting chamber, and she reluctantly moved inside. The walls and floors were barren, cold and claustrophobic. Cozy, isn't it? Should feel just like home. Faith gave Harker the finger. To her surprise, it elicited a grin. So he did have a sense of humor. Or maybe he just appreciated a feisty woman. After I did my time, I promised myself no one would ever lock me up again. My advice, don't make promises you can't keep. You used to be a cop, didn't you? Is that why you have a beef with me? What makes you think I was in law enforcement? You have cop eyes, and you ask questions like a cop. I guess you would know, wouldn't you? Faith took a step toward Harker, who still stood in the cell's doorframe. This is bullshit. There's a killer running around this ship, and you're going to put me in a cage? Harker's response was to turn away from her. Wait! Harker paused. Faith's tone softened. You have something that belongs to me. I would like it back. Harker's face remained without expression. Please, it means a lot to me. There was another moment of hesitation before Harker extracted the hollow disk and tossed it at Faith. Thank you. Faith clutched the disk as if it were a magical talisman. For 5 long years it had served just that function for her. In the grim world of the penal colony, the hologram was the one spark of hope that kept her from giving up and succumbing to her hopeless surroundings. What's happening here? Why would someone kill the crew? And why are we awake? Faith didn't know why she was asking all those questions. Harker knew as little as she did. But once upon a time, he'd been a cop. It was his job to have all the answers, to solve any crime that happened aboard this vessel. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Even though he'd thrown her in a holding cell, and there was little warmth lost between them, his determination gave her some hope. It might just be an illusion, but it was a welcome one. Harker turned away. The door closed and he was erased from view. Faith remained rooted in the cell, torn by a mixture of emotions, wondering how she had managed to step into this mess, wondering how she was going to get out of it. Fuck. She took a seat on the bunk bed and closed her eyes, wishing she was anywhere but aboard this ship. In another part of the vessel, a series of monitors flashed and crackled with electronic life. The screens lit up one by one, showing various images of Harker, Faith, and the other colonists. In one of the images, Faith was pacing back and forth in her holding cell, frustration building. The cell's camera zoomed in on her face, closer and closer, until the image became a searing blur of pixels, the blue of Faith's eyes devouring the screen. Chapter 4. After Harker sealed Faith in the holding cell, he made his way back to the bridge. He had come to the conclusion that Faith was telling the truth. Even though she knew how to handle herself, Harker doubted that the woman could have bested Peterson in a knife fight without even a single bruise or injury to mark her victory. Harker had been a cop longer than Faith had served hard time, and he considered himself a pretty good judge of character. Faith might be many things, but Angus was right. She probably wasn't a cold-blooded psycho killer who went around stabbing people to death. Nevertheless, Harker felt good about his decision to detain her for the time being. He already had his work cut out for him, trying to stave off a panic among the other colonists without having to worry about some shady ex-con looking out for her own self-interest. There was a killer loose aboard the ship, and Harker had a feeling it was only a matter of time before he'd strike again. Feelings of guilt plagued his mind as he strode down the deserted corridor. Harker blamed himself for what had happened to Peterson on the habitat deck. Peterson had made it clear he thought he could handle any challenge that came his way. The former Marine had been asleep for way too long and was itching for a fight. Harker should have known better, but was still a bit groggy from his own cryocycle and didn't overrule him, despite knowing a bad idea when he heard one. His hesitation had cost the kid his life. Unbidden, the image of Peterson flashed into his mind again. Based on Harker's cursory inspection of the stab wounds, they were dealing with a pro, and most likely someone with military training. Most people would thrust in a knife as far as it went, but skin and muscle would cling to the blade, making it difficult to extract. The killer's technique was a short stabbing thrust followed by a half-twist that broke the knife's friction as it was withdrawn. Harker had no sense of the odds they might face, but the killer had easily taken out a former Marine. There was no doubt that the killer knew what he was doing. The insight filled him with grave concern. If their enemy knew how to handle an edged weapon, chances were good he'd also have a few tricks up his sleeve when it came to pulse and ballistic firearms. Ever since laying eyes on Peterson's body, his right hand had been shaking nonstop. His physical response to violence served as a reminder of why Harker had left the force. He had been a cop for almost 2 decades, but when he lost his partner in a brutal gang ambush, he changed. He began to have nightmares, terrible scenarios ripped from everyday experiences, but twisted and magnified by his subconscious fears. Fortunately, dreams could be suppressed. The right pill could guarantee deep REM sleep uninterrupted by dark anxieties. He would wake up the next morning feeling like he had swallowed sand, his mouth parched and chalky from the tranquilizers, but it was a small price to pay for a good night's rest. Far more bothersome than the dreams was his physical response to the possibility of violence. There were the pounding headaches, the outbreaks of nervous perspiration, and of course the shakes, which robbed him of a skill he once prided himself on, the ability to hit a moving target from 300 feet without batting an eye. He was a former sharpshooter who now could not even hold his gun straight, much less hit a virtual perp on a police target range. One of his training officers back at the academy had once cautioned that the job liked to chew up cops and spit them out. Sure enough, today Harker was washed up, burnt out, useless, just another statistic. Broken cops were a dime a dozen. At first he had hoped it would pass. Everyone seemed so reassuring and understanding. He had lost a partner, a man he had come to respect, love, and count on. One couldn't expect to remain untouched after a brush with the violence the city offered its less fortunate Denzians on a daily basis. 4 weeks later, however, Harker resigned just 10 months shy of his retirement. He had turned his back on a job he once lived for. For months he drifted, living off his unemployment payments until he came across an ad on one of the news feeds that turned his life in a new direction. Surprisingly enough, he found himself willing to travel millions of miles to start a new life as a head of security for the Argos mining station. With a colony population of 3,000, it was a far cry from the slums of Los Angeles that had become a third-world state controlled by warring drug gangs. Harker's plans for the future had come crashing down the moment he woke from cryo and realized he might be in for the fight of his life, a battle he would expect to wage back home, not aboard a ship drifting through the quiet darkness of space. Harker arrived back on the bridge and shifted his focus from the past to the problem at hand. The colonists were engaged in a heated exchange. He shot a quick look at Angus, the handsome young mining tech who had stood up for Faith. On some level, Harker didn't hold it against him. Her character might be questionable, but there was no denying that Faith was a striking woman. 10 years earlier, Harker might have reacted in much the same manner. However, his years in global security had taught him that a pretty smile could hide a dark intent. Trust didn't come easy nowadays. "What's going on here?" he asked Angus. The younger man pointed at Michelle, the female colonist who had earlier gone off on Faith. From the moment they were introduced, Harker had immediately sensed that Michelle might become a problem. Sometimes he hated being right. "This lady is losing it," Angus said. "She's accusing us of being part of a conspiracy." Harker shifted his attention to Michelle. Her eyes were wild, hands shaking as they clawed the armrest of the captain's chair. Under the best of circumstances, waking from cryo could be accompanied by bouts of paranoia. Some people had strange reactions to the hibernation gases. Michelle was clearly experiencing a breakdown of some kind. "I know it's hard, but you have to pull yourself together and try to relax." "Relax? I don't see you looking relaxed. We've lost 5 years of our lives. 5 years!" He sighed. The lady was coming unglued. Harker wasn't known as a patient man, and he fought back the urge to raise his voice. His people skills had never been great, and he wished his old partner was here to help out. Harker was the bad cop to Mark's good cop, the yin to his yang. Harker slapped suspects around. Mark sweet-talked them into making a confession. "We're 300 million miles away from Earth, and the crew who is supposed to be flying this vessel is missing." "Missing? Why don't you just come out and say it? They're dead." Harker was tempted to snap back that she was right, that they were all completely fucked, but he somehow maintained his cool. Michelle glared at him, and to his pleasant surprise she stopped talking, tears welling up in her eyes. Thank God for small miracles. "Are you going to be a problem?" Harker asked. The woman glared at Harker, but held her tongue. He was relieved when one of the male colonists, a young kid with a mature expression and a name tag that identified him as Brian, put his arm around the crying woman and took her aside. "What's our next move?" Angus asked. "Good question." "If the lady was telling the truth, Peterson's murderer is still aboard this ship, which means he is able to block our bioscans." Harker didn't know what sort of technology would allow an assassin to remain invisible during a biosweep, but he knew there must be a way. For every security measure, there was always a countermeasure. Harker was about to throw out a half-hearted theory when a shrill, whirring sound burst from the comm panel. Everyone flinched as the disconcerting noise caught them off guard. "What is that?" Michelle gasped, unable to mask her wide-eyed panic. Harker shook his head. It sounded like a jackhammer or power drill. "Computer, identify the sound and tell me where it's coming from." "The sound is emanating from Cargo Deck 6. Someone has activated an asteroid mining drill. Security cams have been shut down. I am currently unable to provide a visual." The computer's voice was silenced as one of the screens flickered to life. It showed an overhead shot of a massive steel vehicle that resembled a tank. Instead of a cannon, a giant drill bit extended from the nose of the vehicle. The tip was spinning with blinding speed, and the sharp sound it made was already grating on Harker's nerves. "I thought the cams were down," Angus said. "Looks like the killer hacked the feed." "Why? What's he doing?" "Playing games," Harker said in a grim voice. He took a step closer to the holo terminal, his penetrating gaze scanning the security feed. He could vaguely make out a strange shape resting on top of the asteroid mining vehicle. He was trying to determine what he was looking at when the camera zeroed in on the object in question, almost as if whoever was in charge of the security feed had read his mind. The new image made everyone on the bridge gasp. Angus took a shocked step back. Splayed on the roof of the cargo crate was Peterson's mauled corpse. Etched in blood around his head like a bloody halo was a chilling message. Come and get me. Chapter 5. Harker, flanked by 3 of the colonists, emerged from an elevator and stepped onto the cargo deck. The group held their pulse guns up and ready. The ear-splitting sound of the spinning asteroid drill made them grit their teeth, and they tried to ignore the sound as best they could. Angus and 2 other colonists had volunteered to join Harker in the search for the killer. On his right stood Rona, a black female with less body fat and more muscle than most guys Harker had ever known. Bringing up the rear was Norris, barrel-chested and slightly overweight despite the year's spin in cryo, but his bulk allowed him to project a sense of power and physical authority. "Stay close together," Harker said. "Don't be a hero and don't do anything stupid." Everyone nodded. Harker and the colonists fanned out. The shadow-cloaked cargo deck awaited them. Rona took the lead and strode past a series of crates, eyes alert and gun sweeping, finger resting lightly on the trigger. As she searched the pools of shadow around her, she took in the giant asteroid drill. The drill was spinning with enough speed and power to bore through tons of asteroid rock. There was no sign of whoever had switched on the device. As Rona took a step closer, she felt a rush of movement behind her. She pivoted just in time for the incoming laser bullet to pierce her forehead. The pulse beam destroyed and cauterized at the same time, leaving a small, perfect hole in its wake. For a moment, Rona stood there, dead, before she collapsed to the cargo deck. Harker saw Rona go down and reacted immediately. He brought up his pulse gun and caught a glimpse of a powerful male silhouette vanishing among the crates. Before he could return fire, 3 searing beams of energy ripped through Norris's chest, and the man went down in a heap of smoking flesh, a shocked expression etched into his now lifeless features. After the second casualty, all hell broke loose. Harker could see Angus's terror-stricken face as he tore off into the shadows of the cargo deck. Harker wanted to shout out after him, urging the young man to stay put. But at this point, everyone was on their own. They'd walked into an ambush. How could he have been so stupid? The answer was simple. Once again, he had underestimated the enemy, feeling secure in their greater numbers. But 4 colonists were no match for the trained killer they were up against. As if to confirm the thought, sizzling beams of energy slammed into the crate next to Harker's head. He burst into motion, bringing up his firearm and unleashing cover fire into the cargo area. He made a sharp right and slipped between crates, the hiss of laser bullets following his escape into the darkness. Angus was hauling ass, driven by mortal fear. He tore past a series of crates, navigated around the 4-wheeled mining vehicle and headed for the open doorway ahead of him. Death was closing in, and Angus had no illusions about the possibility that the blaster in his quivering hand could ward off his murderous pursuer. The gun seemed too small and ineffectual against this spectral opponent. His sole option was to find a place to hide, pray for the best, and with any luck, let the worst of it blow over. Entering the chamber beyond the cargo deck, he took a few tentative steps and went still. An unexpected sight awaited him. A series of high-tech operating tables dominated the large space. Banks of pulsating computer consoles surrounded them. Phosphorescent blue and green lights flashed on the sides of sophisticated operating hubs designed for the most cutting-edge surgeries. Angus realized he stood inside a lab of some kind. Polished metal glittered in the multicolored light. Despite the danger, Angus slowed his gait, eyes wide as he took in the surreal surroundings. Why was there top-of-the-line medical technology on board the Orion? Angus might be just another worker drone, but he knew enough to realize this lab wasn't standard equipment on a C-class mining vessel. Before he could give the matter further thought, the door through which he had entered slid shut behind him, plunging the lab into an eerie half-light. There was no sign of a living soul around him, but instinctively, Angus sensed he was no longer alone. An irrational part of him wanted to call out, but he curbed the impulse. Instead, he kept his gun up and advanced while his eyes scanned his surroundings. From the corner of his eye, Angus caught a flicker of movement. Silhouetted against the blue-red lights of the surgical tables was a human-shaped presence. The killer just stood there, malevolence given shape, and waited for Angus to make a move. He seemed to have all the patience in the world. A sound behind Angus made him whirl, and he felt a surge of fear as one by one the overhead lights burst into life. Another row of operating hubs stood revealed in the light, and each table held a terrible bounty. Human beings were laid out on the surgical steel, secured by iron bands. Each of the men and women sprawled before him were naked. Some patients lying in pools of cold blood were missing limbs and eyes. All were dead. This wasn't an operating room. It was an abattoir. Angus let out a dry gasp, his legs shaking as his pulse raced. The sight had hit him so hard that, for an instant, he lost track of the stranger who had pursued him into this chamber of horrors. It was a costly mistake. Angus heard the killer's sudden footstep. How could he move so fast? A shadow fell over his face. He whirled. Too late. A hand tightened around Angus's neck and lifted all 220 pounds of him off the ground. For a moment he struggled, arms flailing, legs kicking out madly, while only choked and wheezing sounds escaped from his throat. The pressure was cutting off the oxygen to Angus's brain. The black dots dancing in his field of vision grew larger until there was only blackness. His struggles finally ceased and his head lolled back. As if making a sacrifice to some deity of medical technology, the massive silhouette deposited Angus's body on an operating table. This medical altar immediately hummed to life, restraints firing from either side of the table and wrapping themselves around the prone man's limbs and neck. The killer stood there for a moment before melting back into the darkness. As Harker peered around the corner of a cargo crate, he could feel the knots of muscle on the side of his face pulsing with apprehension. He clutched his gun so tightly that his tendons stood out. They were up against a formidable enemy, and he had serious doubts about his chances were he to face the killer on his own. He hoped with all his heart that Angus had managed to escape the madman's clutches. His best move would be to alert the bridge, but he knew his voice might carry across the cargo deck and give away his position. Sudden footsteps brought an abrupt halt to his panicked thoughts. He could see a shape emerge from between a row of cargo crates, the killer remaining hidden in preternatural shadow. Despite his bulk, the man moved with the stealth of a beast of prey, his movements imbued with malicious intent. Harker considered firing at the killer, but the shape kept vanishing behind various pieces of mining equipment, ruining any chance of a clear shot. His hand was shaking, unable of keeping the weapon steady. He watched helplessly, unwilling to risk taking a shot in his current condition, knowing he'd miss and draw a lethal response in return. The massive, unknown entity stepped into an elevator, and the closing doors erased him from view. Wiping the sweat off his forehead, Harker popped out of his hiding place and rushed toward the lift. "Computer, where's that elevator headed?" "The upper deck." Harker wasn't surprised. The killer was making a go for the bridge. "Identify the person in the elevator." He waited for a moment before the computer responded. "Unable to verify identity," the soft-spoken voice informed him. Harker considered this. It was impossible. Everyone aboard the Orion underwent a series of comprehensive biometric scans. The computers should be able to extract a detailed identity profile from the elevator's security feed. Either way, they were dealing with a stowaway, which seemed unlikely considering the 3,000 cams positioned all over the vessel, or the killer had found some clever way to outsmart the system. What were they up against? Harker activated his comlink, doing his best not to sound panicked as he spoke. "Gilardi, this is Harker. The man who took out the crew is headed for the bridge." For a split second he thought he could hear someone answering on the other end, but the voice broke up, devoured by a crackle of spitting static, and the line went dead. A second later, Angus's pitiful scream filled the cargo deck. It was the bone-chilling sound of a man being tortured to death. On the command bridge, Gilardi was trying to reach Harker. Michelle shot him a nervous look. What's going on down there? I don't know. I had Harker on the line for a second, but I just lost contact with him. What do you mean you lost contact? Michelle said, her terror coming through loud and clear. Before Gilardi could retort, the door to the bridge whooshed open. All eyes turned toward the new arrival. Their curiosity was met with cruel fire as bursts of a laser scalded the bridge and instantly found their human targets. Chapter 6. Faith studied her tiny cell. Once again, she was a prisoner. She was still reeling from the rough treatment she had received back on the bridge. It had served as a sharp reminder that her criminal deeds would continue to cast a large shadow no matter where she went, or how many millions of miles she put between herself and her past. She was tainted, damaged goods, an untrustworthy ex-con just waiting to relapse to her old ways. With nothing else to occupy herself, Faith played the hologram of the little girl she had never gotten to know. She knew the soothing image held the power to lull her into a trance-like state until sleep would overcome her. It was a habit she had picked up in prison. When her world turned to shit, the image of the smiling girl served as a digital talisman able to ward off any dark thoughts and hold the real world at bay. Unfortunately, this time the image of the little girl failed to calm her. Instead, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Every time the child's lips playfully crinkled, she could see Marcus in the little girl. Marcus, who'd been dead for 10 years. Marcus, whom she had loved like no other man before or since. She met him the way so many couples first connected, at a bar. Marcus was drinking by himself, bombed but somehow making it look good. He radiated a wild, untamed air of danger, reinforced by the tattoos etched into his sinewy arms and confirmed by the dark expression on his face. Nevertheless, there was a forlorn, broken quality to his empty stare in which Faith recognized a part of herself. The world knew Marcus as a tough customer you didn't want to cross, a career criminal who wouldn't shy away from using violence to get what he wanted. Faith saw beneath his exterior, where there were still remnants of a wounded, frightened boy who never had a chance. It was a silent understanding between them, an instinctive knowledge of where they came from and where they might be headed. Faith was immediately drawn to him. That night, she took Marcus back to her room at the run-down capsule motel she had called home since ditching her stepfather's apartment. They'd both been too drunk to make love, and instead just lay in each other's arms. From the start, Faith felt a connection like none she had experienced before. As the days passed, she learned more about the new man in her life. She discovered that Marcus was an ex-con who specialized in armed robbery and was back to plying his trade. Despite his criminal background, or maybe because of it, she couldn't stop thinking about this enigma who had entered her life. The love bug had bitten her hard. She knew she would follow him anywhere, do whatever he told her to do. They became inseparable. He could be vicious, brutal, and merciless with others, but between them, she experienced only warmth. Two fragmented souls were drawn into each other's orbit, only feeling whole when they were together. It was during these first heady, passionate months that Faith got pregnant. She worried that this new development would upset her new love. Before they could discuss the matter, Marcus lured her into joining him for a robbery. He promised that it would change their lives, a big score they could live off of for years to come. His friends had cased a pharmaceutical lab and found a way to breach its security. There was a plan in place that promised no one would get hurt. He had made it sound so easy. With the loot the heist would net them, they could change their lives, build a future, live happily ever after. However, given her condition, to Faith the idea of wielding a pulse gun and committing a serious crime seemed especially risky. And still she hesitated in telling Marcus about the pregnancy. Instead, she nodded her agreement and indicated that she was ready to experience her first taste of action. She always regretted holding back the news of the baby. Had Marcus known, maybe he would have had a change of heart. Maybe the last 10 years would have turned out differently. A scream pierced the silence inside the holding cell, interrupting her mental journey into the past. Muffled sounds followed. Faith went white and jumped to her feet. Had the killer struck again? Faith's gaze shifted to the hologram still clutched in her hand. She switched off the image, pocketed the item, and rose from the cot. The distant sizzling of laser guns firing replaced the screams. More screams followed, louder now, taking on a sharper edge. If the killer popped into her cell, she would be cornered with no place to go. Shit. She had to get out of this death trap. Once again, she silently cursed Harker for locking her up and approached the holding cell's door. She fought back her fear and found her center, her mind focusing on the problem at hand. She studied the doorway's electronic control panel with its built-in computer screen. Harker used a security code to lock her inside the cell, and she had neither the time nor the skill set to hack the system and break the code. It was hopeless. To Faith's surprise, the cell door suddenly opened, revealing the deserted, dark corridor beyond. It was almost as if she were being prompted to leave the cell by an invisible host who wanted her to join the real festivities on the bridge. After a beat of hesitation, Faith took her first cautious step through the doorway. Maybe someone on the command bridge had decided to release her in an act of mercy once the screaming started. Or was someone else pulling the strings? Either way, she couldn't stay put, another important lesson she had learned in prison. Inactivity meant you were scared, and scared got you shanked. The holding cell was located at the end of a long corridor that connected to the Orion's command center. Her best option was to pass through the bridge to reach elevators that could take her to another deck. She sprinted down the eerie passage, her eyes alert, nerves on fire, wishing she had a weapon of some sort. Less than 30 seconds later, she reached the end of the hallway. She paused to catch her breath. No sounds emanated from behind the door. Realizing she had no other choice, she tapped the door's control panel and it slid open. Faith took her first weary step onto the bridge, eyes casting around her surroundings, and froze. She suddenly wished she had never left the holding cell. Angus's anguished cry resounded over the cargo deck, and Harker's heart thudded in his ears. The wail died down before it resumed once more, the pitch and timbre of the man's torment now magnified. Harker was paralyzed for a second, but the continuous soundtrack of the man's suffering motivated him to shake off his terror. He ran deeper into the cargo area. He thumbed his comlink, hoping to reach the bridge, but his efforts were rewarded with hissing static. Angus cried out again, and Harker was able to track it. What the hell was happening to him? These weren't cries for help, but an outpouring of unbridled anguish. Angus was being brutalized. For a moment, the gun felt rock steady in Harker's hand. The shakes were gone, replaced by a burning rage. Harker spotted the entrance through which Angus had passed a few minutes earlier and stepped into the lab, the shadows swallowing him whole. The instant he set foot in the room, the pain-filled screams stopped. He advanced, eyes taking in the operating tables and sleek lab equipment with growing disbelief. What was this place? What dark purpose could it serve? He cast his gaze around the lab and quickly located Angus, or at least what was left of him. The man was still restrained to the operating table by steel bands. His legs had been amputated, just cauterized stumps where the limbs once were. Before Harker could even process what he was seeing, he spotted 6 articulated robotic arms that dangled above the hapless colonist like metallic tentacles, part of the table's operating hub. One of the robotic arms swung toward Angus's torso, and a searing beam of light shot from its tip to laser off his arms in one fell swing. Another tentacle caught the severed limb and disappeared with its gruesome prize into the ceiling of the lab. The sight of Angus's mutilated torso was too much to process. Harker stood horror-stricken as the man tilted his head to look at him. Eyeing Harker through a cloud of pain, he whispered, "Help me." There wasn't anything in the world Harker would rather do. He took a step toward Angus. The laser cutter had cauterized the wound so cleanly that he wasn't going to bleed out. A sudden whir gave Harker pause, and his attention turned with dread to the ceiling. A robotic arm was unfurling toward Harker. It swung out and hurled him across the lab. He crumpled to the floor. Shaking off the impact, he managed to scramble back to his feet just in time to see the robot arms perform a series of precision laser cuts all over Angus's body. These were thinner, more concentrated beams that didn't cauterize, the blood blooming from Angus's new open wounds. Before Harker could react, the laser beams were switched off and metallic prongs burst from the tips of the robotic arms, hooking into the loosened folds of Angus's skin. With brutal precision, the arms pulled the skin off the man in a series of quick moves, flaying him in seconds. A writhing mass of shiny red muscle remained on a blood-soaked surface that had transformed from an operating table into a butchered slab. Angus's terrified eyes stared out of the exposed, glistening meat. Everything happened so fast that both Harker and Angus were in shock for a second before the full horror of what had just transpired dawned on them. Angus's lips twisted into a scream when a nozzle above the operating table sprayed him with a gray-blue liquid. With a hiss of sizzling flesh, liquid metal encased his exposed tissue, binding to bone and flesh and forming a second skin. Between the man's heaving cries of unimaginable pain, Harker could make out 2 words. "Kill me." Harker's hand stopped shaking. He brought up the blaster and fired without hesitation. The beam slammed into Angus's chest, ending the man's suffering. The screams had been terrible, but the silence that followed was far more chilling. Harker was gasping for air, grappling with his own mind-bending terror. The robotic arms undulated and spun toward Harker. He felt the blade at the end slash his uniform and draw blood. This finally triggered a reaction. Harker turned and ran for his life. Faith had not stirred since setting foot on the bridge, her body rigid with fear. She was confronted by a landscape of death. Lifeless members of the crew slumped in chairs, sprawled on the floor. She saw cauterized, scorched flesh wherever she turned, slit throats and blood-spattered computer panels, a tableau from a nightmare. Faith couldn't help herself. Her body started to tremble, an involuntary reaction over which she had no control. She considered herself a pretty tough broad, but this was unlike anything she had ever witnessed before. She understood violence, had always lived with it in one form or another, but the sight before her rattled her to the core. The sudden sound of Harker's voice cut the silence like a knife, penetrating the horror. "Gilardi, are you there? Talk to me." Faith's gaze cleared. She combed the bridge and realized the source of the voice was a dead crew member's comlink. Energized, Faith approached Gilardi's corpse. There was a deep gash in his throat and his chest was soaked with arterial blood. She crouched down and reached for the comlink. She was doing her best to avoid the blood, but her fingers were stained scarlet by the time she managed to pry the comm from Gilardi's wrist. Her voice felt drained of all emotion, shell-shocked as she palmed the communicator. "They're dead. They're all dead," Harker replied to her hoarse whisper. "Faith, is that you? What are you doing on the bridge? Faith!" She didn't respond, her attention drawn to a holo terminal that had come to life. The computer was playing back a holo file of a scene recorded earlier on the bridge. On screen, Faith was trying to convince a skeptical Harker of her innocence. "I swear, I had nothing to do with this," she said. "Don't trust her," Michelle interjected, her voice laced with burgeoning panic, almost as if she knew she wouldn't survive beyond the hour. One more screen lit up. It was another recording taken on the bridge. In the security feed, 6 colonists were gathered. Faith didn't recognize any of them. Even though the faces were unfamiliar, the emotions were not. One of the colonists, a rugged black man with long dreads and Ashanti tattoos, barked in a sharp voice that did little to mask his fear. "Where the fuck is the crew?" Before Faith could make sense of this latest image, another holo terminal turned on, and another. Each screen showed a twisted funhouse mirror version of the one preceding it. Each time a crew of colonists shared their growing panic and confusion. The scene repeated itself again and again. They weren't the first group of colonists to wake from cryo. How long had this been going on aboard the Orion? Her speculation came to a halt as a door opened to her left. The beat of incoming footfalls grew audible. Her escape route had been cut off. She considered making a go for the door that led back to the holding cell, but quickly realized she would never make it in time. A grim certainty gripped her. Death was coming for her. What the hell is happening up there? Talk to me. Faith killed the comlink, cutting Harker off. Her eyes ticked back and forth, hoping to find another way of escape, but knowing there was none. She was trapped. Panicked, she took in the collection of dead bodies, and her pupils dilated with sudden inspiration. She threw herself to the ground right next to the other bodies. Michelle stared back at her with empty, dead eyes. Faith lacked confidence in her own plan, but what else could she do? Deciding to play dead might turn out to be a fatal mistake, but she was fresh out of options. If the man who was about to step onto the bridge was the same man who'd killed these hapless colonists, and Faith had a feeling he was, he would remember that she wasn't one of his victims here. But with their mining tech uniforms, they all looked the same. With a bridge full of dead bodies, he might not take note of one more body. It required all her self-control to stay put as the killer arrived. A pair of leather boots grew visible in her low-angle view of the room. The boots crunched as the massive figure moved around the bridge. They turned back toward Faith. She swallowed her breath, heart and mind racing. Fighting back the urge to flee, she somehow managed to remain motionless. The killer circled the captain's chair, moving closer. Faith stared helplessly at approaching death. Her attention shifted from the advancing boots to the bodies and spotted an item that provided a flash of hope: a plasma gun. One of the colonists must have dropped it during the killer's earlier assault. Should she make a go for the gun? Could she reach it in time? Faith's body remained primed, ready to spring into action, when she noticed one of the male colonists. She remembered his name being Brian, inching across the floor, trailing blood. Making his way toward Faith, towards the pulse gun. So Faith wasn't the only one playing dead. Even if Brian still had some fight left in him, he wouldn't last for much longer. His wounds looked serious, and he was barely clinging to life. A dead man too stubborn to roll over and perish, deciding instead to fight to the bitter end, was an attitude Faith could respect. For a moment their eyes met. Brian's haunted yet determined expression urged Faith to stay put. At the same time, the boots paused. An eternal moment dragged on before they closed in on Faith once more. Who the hell did she think she was fooling? This psycho knew exactly what was happening here. He was merely toying with her, dragging out the inevitable. Her thoughts received terrifying confirmation as the advancing figure unsheathed a shiver blade that started to vibrate at great speed. Both Brian and Faith knew the game was up. They'd been made. She had to do something. Right now. React, goddammit! Brian made a go for the blaster, fingers closing around the gun. He turned toward the killer just as a boot shot out with inhuman speed. It knocked the gun away, crushing his wrist with a bone-breaking snap. The gun clattered on the floor. Without hesitation, the blade lashed out at Brian's throat. In and out, a splash of red as shivering steel penetrated soft flesh like butter. The shocked colonist exhaled blood and his eyes glazed. For a brief moment, the murderer's back was turned to Faith. As terrified as she was, Faith knew this would be her last chance. It was now or never. She jumped to her feet. The killer's head snapped toward Faith, and she let out a sharp gasp. Oh my God! Pink, inhuman eyes that looked like ghastly wounds glared back at her from an albino death mask. A skull shimmered through the translucent skin, and Faith could make out a web of arteries and veins feeding blood to a throbbing brain. The killer's body was humanoid, and he wore the uniform of a crew member, the fabric shredded, hanging in tatters off his gargantuan frame. Milky, see-through skin poked from torn patches of uniform and appeared to be molded from a carapace-like material. As the killer advanced, Faith could see organs pulsating and twitching under the transparent flesh. What the fuck was this thing? Faith took a step back while the creature kept tracking her, its powerful limbs flexed with dangerous anticipation. No longer thinking, just reacting, Faith propelled herself through an open doorway and flew down the corridor before her. Legs pistoning at full sprint, she couldn't shake the memory of the last chilling detail she had noticed about her attacker. Her eyes had fastened on the name tag on the killer's blood-stained overalls. It identified him as Soccorso, a name Faith remembered from the day she boarded the vessel. The monstrous distortion of flesh that had murdered the crew was the captain of the ship. Chapter 7. Faith pounded down an endless, winding corridor. Her heart raced, legs pumping on their own volition, fueled by raging adrenaline. She reached the elevator at the end of the hallway and stabbed the button on the control panel. Waiting impatiently, she kept braving frantic glances down the corridor, expecting the killer to appear any instant now. Her hands were trembling, but she couldn't make them stop. She tried to shake off the horror, the scene on the bridge replaying again and again in her mind. What had she just experienced? Had the monster been the captain of the Orion? If so, what could trigger such a terrifying transformation? Humanity had colonized most of the Sol system and only recently begun to venture beyond. So far, they hadn't come across any other life forms, intelligent or otherwise. For now, humanity was still alone in the universe unless you chose to believe the authorities were hiding the truth from the world. Faith believed in secrets, but put little heed in organized conspiracies. Certain truths could not remain hidden for long, no matter how hard an organization might try to suppress the information. Nevertheless, the killer's changed biology raised questions and brought forth images of the various holoflicks she'd seen over the years, where hapless space travelers encountered alien parasites that could wreak havoc on their biology. Stop it, Faith ordered herself. No point in engaging in rampant, counterproductive speculation. Damn it, where was the fucking elevator? To her great relief, just then the lift arrived. The doors split open and Harker jumped out, gun leveled. Stay right where you are, he ordered. Listen, we don't have time for this. We need to keep Faith paused in mid-sentence. She saw the shock in Harker's expression and understood its dark significance. She whirled. The creature lurked at the far end of the hallway. He had caught up with them. Harker brought up his pulse gun. Laser bullets slammed into the killer's chest. He stumbled backward, but remained on his feet. Faith swapped a dire glance with Harker. He was beginning to realize that their attacker was more than human. Pulse rounds pockmarked the walls around them, and they retreated into the elevator. The doors hissed shut. Faith punched the down button, selecting one of the lower decks as their destination. The lift hummed and started to descend. Still reeling, Faith looked at Harker to find the former cop studying her, his exasperated expression questioning. What the fuck is that thing? I think that thing used to be the captain of the ship. Harker stared at her with incomprehension. He's been altered. Dermal armor of some sort. Biomodifications. Harker switched on his wristcom. Faith shook her head. Don't bother. I told you. Everyone on the bridge is gone. We're all that's left. Faith knew Harker didn't entirely believe her. She didn't want to believe it either. A sudden metallic groan drew their attention. The elevator slowed. Something was terribly wrong. As if to confirm her worst fears, the cab ground to a complete stop. Faith and Harker waited in hushed silence. A beat later, the elevator hummed back to life. Now moving upwards, floors ascending as it rushed back toward the upper deck where that thing was certainly waiting for them, weapon ready. How is he doing this? Faith asked. He must be interfaced with the ship's central computer, Harker explained. The floor numbers on the digital readout kept rising. Any way we can shut down the system? Harker shook his head. Faith could feel panic threatening to overwhelm her, but she fought the temptation to give up. She hadn't succumbed to the darkness back on Luna all those years ago, and she wouldn't allow herself to be victimized now. If her destiny was to perish aboard this ship, she'd make damn sure she wouldn't go down without a fight. She felt her fear make way for anger, and she tapped into this emotion, hoping to use it to her advantage. A plan had formed in her mind. Your pulse gun. Overcharge its power source. What are you talking about? The only way we're going to stop this elevator is if we disrupt its magnetic field. A small explosion should do the trick. Understanding dawned on Harker's face. If it doesn't kill us first. You have any better ideas? Harker shook his head. He flipped a switch on the pulse gun and lights flashed on the weapon's chamber. While Harker charged the weapon, Faith studied the elevator roof. I need a lift. Harker understood. He stepped closer to Faith, both suddenly aware of their physical proximity. Lights kept flashing on the gun, a hum building as its power source began to overheat. Harker grabbed her by the wrist and gave her a boost. She could feel his head pressing against her belly, the strength of his hands pushing against her legs and waist, and this made her realize she hadn't felt the touch of another human being in a long time, much less a man's. She felt a momentary amusement at the strangeness of that thought coming in the face of death. Faith's hands touched the roof of the elevator, gave it a push, and succeeded in popping it open. She poked her head through the opening, now looking up at the never-ending tunnel above them. "Hand me the weapon," she said. Harker did as instructed, and Faith snatched the vibrating gun from his fingers, placing it on top of the elevator car. Task complete. She quickly sealed the roof hatch. Harker gently lowered her to the elevator floor. They withdrew into a corner and crouched down, forming a human ball. Once again, Faith was acutely aware of the physical contact. Harker's graying stubble chafing her skin, the man's heady scent, his muffled breath. There was nothing erotic about the forced closeness. It was merely an attempt to maximize their chances at survival. Neither of them could predict the extent of the damage once the weapon blew up, so they simply prepared themselves for the imminent blast. There would be shrapnel, but Faith hoped the roof would absorb most of the power of the explosion. She blotted out all other thoughts and shifted her focus to the climbing numbers on the lift's control panel, counting each deck in her head, realizing that any second now the elevator would reach its dark destination. The doors would part, and her world would end in a furious hail of laser fire. She suddenly felt like a complete fool. They had sacrificed their only weapon for some half-assed plan that was more liable to get them killed than save them. A fearsome explosion tore through the climbing elevator. The blast ripped a hole in the roof, and a vortex of withering metal strafed the interior. Pieces of metal punched through the walls and floor. The elevator car groaned and creaked and started to plummet, a dizzying descent that pressed Faith and Harker even harder against each other. Her stomach jumped into her throat. The explosion had disrupted the maglev field, and the lift was now plunging down the shaft at breakneck speed. The plan had worked, but it was looking like it might end with them dead at the bottom of the shaft, buried beneath a ton of shattered steel. Time distended in Faith's mind as the lift seemed to pick up even more speed in its free fall. She was counting on the emergency brakes to kick in, but maybe that had been wishful thinking on her part. To Faith's relief, the elevator started to slow as the brakes began to do their job. Then a sudden grinding stop jolted the lift. For a moment, neither Faith nor Harker stirred, still holding on to each other for dear life and terrified that shifting their weight might send the elevator crashing further down the shaft. Faith finally moved, groggy, bleeding from numerous small cuts, and caught Harker's eye. His expression mirrored her own. He couldn't quite believe that they were still alive. Faith stumbled to her feet, shaking off the debris. It appeared the elevator car had stopped between floors. It took another moment to gather the will to move. She knew she couldn't allow herself to rest. This was just a momentary reprieve. There was no doubt the killer would not be fazed by the slight setback. Chances were that he was already preparing a counter-move. They had to get off the ship before their luck ran out. Her gaze traveled to the half-exposed elevator door. She nodded at Harker, and he joined her. Together they pried the door open, one strenuous inch at a time. On the upper deck, the silent behemoth who had once been the captain of the Orion waited for the elevator to arrive. The gore-streaked shiver blade in his hand vibrated in hungry anticipation. When the lights stopped climbing on the elevator's control panel, the killer interfaced with the ship's security system. The data stream from over 200 onboard cameras filled his field of vision. He flipped through his visual barrage with speed and precision, freezing the stream of images when he caught his first glimpse of Faith. A security cam showed her wriggling her way out of the half-open elevator door. Only a third of the lift was aligned with the floor, providing a small space to slip through. Data slashed over the killer's enhanced field of vision, identifying the floor as one of the lower decks. His inhuman features registered no emotion as he turned and resumed the hunt. Chapter 8. Faith angled her way through the aperture to escape the elevator and survey the adjoining corridor. A barren, metallic passage. She was back on one of the Orion's lower decks where the hyperstasis chambers were located. Her hands were still quivering, and she couldn't quite believe the plan had worked. Harker appeared behind her. "Do you believe me now when I tell you I had nothing to do with this?" Harker nodded, seeing Faith in a new light. "That was some quick thinking back there. 10 years in the slammer teaches you a trick or two." "No shit. What are we up against here? Where are the others?" Harker didn't answer, but the haunted 1,000-yard stare told Faith everything she needed to know. He wasn't ready to talk about what happened. At least not yet. And truth be told, Faith wasn't so sure she wanted to hear this story. The bottom line, no one was left from the group of colonists that had woken from cryo. Fueled by soaring adrenaline, Faith stepped up to the elevator's control panel. She felt like a machine driven by one objective: survival. "Computer, how do I reach the nearest lifeboat area?" 3D schematics of the ship appeared on the elevator's control panel. A red light indicated Faith's current whereabouts, and a phosphorescent green area represented the life pod bay. A red line began to plot the fastest route. "What are you doing?" Harker asked. "What does it look like? I'm getting the hell off this ship." Harker stared at her with disbelief. "You're going to leave 4,000 colonists at the mercy of this monster? An hour ago you wanted to lock me up. Now you're asking me to play hero? A lot has happened since then. No offense, but we don't stand a chance against that monster. Our best bet is to get off this ship and radio for help. We're all that stands between that construct and everyone else aboard the Orion. We can't abandon these people. Watch me." Faith wasn't heartless, but damn it, getting herself killed wouldn't save these colonists. Their only option was to send a distress signal and hope someone would pick it up in time. If Harker wanted to go down with the ship, so be it. She wasn't a hero. Far from it. In the end, she was just another colonist who happened to find herself in the wrong place at the wrong time and had to make the best of it. They had gotten lucky in the elevator, and she doubted that their string of good fortune would continue for much longer. She hadn't survived the lunar penal colony to end up a victim on a colony junker. Her odds of rescue in a life pod might not be great either, but it beat waiting to meet a grisly end aboard this ship of horrors. Faith turned away from Harker. She barely managed to take a few steps before he caught up with her and grabbed her arm, slamming her against the wall. She glared at Harker, the force behind the man's grip making her bristle. This was a different kind of physical proximity, and Faith had zero tolerance for it. "Let go of me." Harker backed off, responding to her sharp tone of voice and the silent threat it carried. His features grew cold in response. "I should have known not to expect anything from you. You don't know anything about me, so back the fuck off." Harker pulled away and Faith relaxed slightly, the tension draining from her body. She bristled at the idea of fighting it out with Harker, but she wouldn't shy away from it if push came to shove. "I'm getting off this ship, and if you're smarter than you look, you'll do the same. How do you expect to leave when there are no lifeboats?" "What are you talking about?" Harker turned to the nearest comm panel. "Computer, what is the status of the lifeboats aboard the Orion?" "All lifeboats were launched 4 years ago." "Please provide a visual." A hollow image of the empty lifeboat bay appeared. All boats were indeed gone. What now? All of a sudden, Faith craved a cigarette. Just one hit to set her mind straight. "If you still don't believe me, you can check for yourself. But you better move fast. If the killer can interface with the elevators, chances are he has access to all the security feeds. He knows where we are. That thing is probably on its way to the lower decks as we speak." Harker took a step closer. "You say you want to start over? Put your past behind you? Then do it." "What the hell are you talking about?" "You can't change your past, but you can change who you are right now. Help these people." "I have nothing to prove to you." "What about to yourself? We can't keep running because there's no place to run to. We're stuck aboard this ship, and that means we have to confront this son of a bitch." "I already did. Only reason I'm standing here is because I got real lucky." "You're not alone this time." The words reached Faith and stirred a thought. Harker had inadvertently given her an idea. There was another way to improve their odds. After a beat, she said, "You got that right." Here we are again, Faith thought. She was back inside the vast, cavernous hypersleep chamber. Checking the time, Faith couldn't believe that only hours had passed since she awoke from cryosleep. It felt more like days since her peaceful slumber was interrupted and replaced with a reality that had ceased making sense a long time ago. "You better hurry. If he can interface with the elevator systems, he won't have a problem accessing the ship's security feed. I'm pretty sure he knows we're here. Just relax. I'm working as fast as I can." Harker accessed a control board near the chamber's entrance, and a pale fluorescent light burst to life, revealing hundreds of cryo-cylinders. Faith once again took in the sleeping colonists, all of them blissfully unaware of what had transpired aboard the ship that was supposed to safely transport them to the main belt. Her eyes locked on a tube that held the body of a little girl. Faith speculated that she must be the daughter of one of the colonists. The sight of the child made her breath hitch, reminding her of the little girl in the treasured hologram. Faith touched the surface of the glass cylinder, her gaze lingering on the little girl's peaceful expression. She was dreaming dreams unencumbered by the horror Faith had just experienced. Faith addressed the whole room of colonists as she spoke. "What does he want from you?" The question hung in the air, echoing in the vast chamber. Harker didn't offer up a theory or try to present her with some half-assed answer. Instead, he kept manipulating the terminal, remaining focused on the task at hand. "Waking up a couple hundred colonists should change the odds," Harker said. "I just hope we're not going to get a bunch of innocent people killed here." The same thought had crossed Faith's mind when she proposed the plan, but she couldn't allow doubt to take hold. They weren't going to wake up everyone, just enough people to even the odds. A trained killer could easily pick off 8 colonists. He might find it harder going up against 100. Harker leaned over the hypersleep control system and tapped a few keys. Lights flashed and the names of the colonists scrolled down a holo terminal. As Harker went about his task, he shot Faith a sideways glance. "So, how did you manage to get out of that holding cell?" Faith didn't answer. "Let me guess. Another trick you picked up while doing hard time." "Prison does teach you to improvise." "I bet. To be honest, I can't take credit for the Houdini act. Someone decided to let me out of the cell." The explanation earned a puzzled frown from Harker. "I assumed at first that someone on the bridge overrode the locking mechanism once the killer attacked. But now you're not so sure. He seems to be interfaced with most of the ship. I think he knew I was in the cell, and for some reason he let me out." "That makes no sense." Faith couldn't argue with the sentiment. Nothing was making sense right now. Harker tapped a few more buttons and the screen filled with the life signs of the various colonists. As his hands moved back and forth, navigating the various menus of the floating holoscreens before him, he asked a question Faith had heard almost on a daily basis since she wrapped up her stint on the penal colony. "So what were you in for? Who did you screw with?" "You mean, who didn't I screw?" Her response earned a grin from Harker, but Faith wasn't amused. She had hoped that out here among the stars she could escape the woman she'd once been and concentrate on the person she wanted to become. Funny how the past had a way of catching up with you no matter where you went. From the way Harker studied her, Faith could tell he wanted to hear more, but was smart enough to know he wouldn't be getting the full story. Harker thumbed another button. A new wave of text appeared on the holo terminal. "Initiating hypersleep wake-up sequence." A satisfied smile played across Harker's face as he took in the multitude of hyperstasis capsules. "Here we go. Rise and shine." He made another hand gesture and tapped the floating holo screen. Lights flashed and a new message replaced the various readings. "Wake-up sequence aborted." Faith shot Harker a querying glance. "What's the problem?" Harker didn't answer, but instead opted for another approach. His fingers tapped more keys. His efforts were rewarded with the same message. "Come on, come on." Still no response. "Fuck!" Harker took a step back from the terminal, grudging respect mixing with an air of defeat. Understanding dawned on Faith. He overrode the hyperstasis system. "The bastard's not leaving anything up to chance," Harker said. The same thought had crossed Faith's mind. A sudden sound made them both whirl. Faith and Harker exchanged a brief glance, sensing that they might not be alone any longer. Their eyes penetrated the shadow-cloaked chamber, scoping, waiting for the sound to repeat itself. "He's here," Faith said. As if to confirm her words, a laser bullet slammed into the hypersleep tube right next to her in an explosion of glass and blood. The helpless colonist inside the tube spasmed and twitched, his body going into shock. Faith stared, shaken by the sight of the dying man and the horror of his predicament. Mercifully, his body slumped forward without regaining consciousness. Without having to exchange any further words, Faith and Harker burst into motion and darted into the maze of glass cylinders. 2 more hungry pulse blasts rippled through the chamber, slamming into glass in the warm, dormant flesh it held. Another hyperstasis chamber shattered and a body thumped to the ground in a rain of crimson cryofluids. Faith averted her gaze. She didn't want to know more about the latest innocent casualty, didn't want their faces burnt into her memory for all time. Moving, they zigzagged through the labyrinth of sleeping colonists. Faith and Harker dipped behind another tube, seeking cover from an enemy they couldn't even see. They listened while holding their collective breath. Seconds stretched. Faith knew the killer lurked in the dark maze of cryotubes, stalking them, no sound or movement betraying his presence. A ghost. Impatience getting the better of her, Faith poked her head up from behind the hypersleep tubes. Nothing. A sudden creaking sound above her gave her pause. She tilted her head and spotted movement in the web of catwalks that extended over the main floor of the hyperstasis chamber like the filaments of a giant metallic net. A monstrous figure loomed on the catwalk. The elevated vantage point gave the killer a perfect overview of the cryo chamber. Shit! He had the high ground. This was like shooting fish in a barrel. Then Faith noticed something even more disturbing than the presence of the creature that was hunting them. A surreal sight that defied her immediate understanding. For a brief moment, the killer stopped taking center stage in her mind. The adjoining row of tubes was identical to all the others except for one crucial difference. These were empty. Hundreds of colonists were missing from the capsules. Faith gasped at the rows upon rows of empty cryotubes. Faith remembered the security feeds back on the bridge, which showed her groups of colonists waking from cryo and facing a crewless vessel. She experienced a pronounced foreboding. If these capsules were empty, and the computer wasn't picking up additional life signs. Oh my God, they're all gone. The moment of existential horror made way for a whirl of sizzling energy. Hot plasma chopped the floor next to Faith's feet. She bolted from her hiding place, knowing they'd been made, and dashed toward the nearest exit. Faith heard more than saw the killer jumping from the catwalk and landing 20 feet below with superhuman grace, his legs smoothly absorbing the impact of the jump. The maneuver would have earned even the most skilled Olympic athlete a broken ankle, but it didn't even slow the killer down. What were they up against here? Faith dashed past another row of tubes, Harker at her side, and knifed through a doorway. The hunt was back on. Chapter 9. They were only halfway down the corridor when the dark shape of the killer emerged from the hyperstasis chamber, his bulk filling the hallway behind them. Considering the monster's biological enhancements, Faith had no doubt it would reach them in no time. Harker saw it too, and opted to try his luck in one of the adjoining chambers that lined the corridor. Faith hesitated, fearing that the room would prove to be a dead end, but she couldn't face the killer unarmed and alone. She slipped through the door and Harker punched the access panel. The door hissed shut with a deafening clang, sealing them in the chamber. Faith took in the room. Crates and various cargo containers cluttered the space. "What will stop him from overriding the door's locking mechanism?" she asked. A good question, and one that Harker must have already contemplated, because he immediately grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and started pounding the control panel until it shattered in a furious rain of sparks. For good measure, he aimed the nozzle at the exposed circuitry and fired off a blast of carbon dioxide. The door's control panel fizzled out and grew dim. It was perfect timing. A loud whomp sounded as the killer's fist dented the door from the other side. The metal buckled and twisted but held fast. Harker and Faith awaited the killer's next move with bated breath. As the seconds ticked by, she carefully surveyed the room, hoping it would slow her thudding heartbeat. There were no other exits, not even an air duct. They were trapped in here. Judging from the despondent expression on Harker's face, he'd come to the same conclusion. Faith's gaze traveled to the security cams mounted above the door. If the killer was still interfaced with the system, he was watching them right now. Waiting, biding his time, fury spread over her features and detonated. She snatched the fire extinguisher right out of Harker's hand and stepped up to the door, eyes locked on the camera mounted above her. "Fuck off!" She brought up the extinguisher and shattered the camera. Outside the supply room, the killer stepped away from the dented door. In an upper corner of his field of vision, a small screen showed Faith and Harker inside the storage room. They were breathing hard, eyes filled with terror. Faith seized the fire extinguisher, and it filled the creature's point of view for an instant before there was a loud crack, followed by static and darkness. New information appeared before his eyes, a 3D floor plan of the lower decks. The holographic model revolved as the killer zeroed in on the supply room. The chamber was magnified and various tech specs appeared. Supply room 4. Life support system status, active. The text changed from active to disabled, followed by a new message. Oxygen levels, 100, 99, 98. Harker cast a long look at Faith, who was still facing the security camera, fire extinguisher clutched in her shaking hands, jaw clenched, breath coming in short bursts. What exactly did that accomplish? Makes me feel better. Harker's lips curled into a hint of a smile, conceding her point. Faith suddenly perked up, her ears having picked up a strange noise. Harker took note of her changed expression. What is it? Faith held up her right hand, motioning Harker to be quiet. She listened intently. Harker followed her example. Faith could tell from the look in Harker's eyes that he could make out the sound too, a vacuuming noise. They swapped glances. Is that what I think it is? Faith asked. The ventilation system. Harker had barely uttered the words when he lost his balance, legs buckling. Faith caught him before he could hit the floor and grew aware of her own shortness of breath. He turned off life support, sucking out all the air. Growing dizzy, she leaned against the wall for support and sighed. Oxygen level must be already about 10%. In another minute or two. Harker didn't need to finish the thought. They had to get out of this death trap. Faith staggered toward the warped door, all movement growing more strenuous, each breath becoming coarse and labored. She studied the door and its shattered control panel, trying to determine if there was another way she could possibly open it. It's useless. I fried the control system. It would take hours to get it back up and running. What are we going to do? We could lie down and die, Faith thought for a second before she fought back her despair. Rage overcame her growing sense of helplessness. She couldn't give up without a fight. Never. She would resist until the last breath. In this case, literally. There had to be another way. Her gaze combed the supply room and locked on the cargo crates. Driven by the germ of an idea, Faith scrambled toward them. What are you looking for? Faith didn't answer. Instead, she tore open one crate after another, fighting her way through a mountain of mining equipment, a woman on a mission. Harker grabbed her shoulder. Faith, talk to me so I can help. Faith peered up from an open crate and flashed Harker a triumphant smile as she held a plasma cutter aloft. We're going to burn our way out of here. Faith pointed at the open crate. A series of identical laser cutters were stacked on top of each other. Within seconds, they were both holding a torch against the wall. Their breath came in wheezing drags, lungs working hard to gulp down the final wisps of breathable air. It took everything they had to stay on their feet and not pass out. Sweat stung their eyes, their features bathed red in the laser torch's fiery halo. The sizzle of melting iron filled the supply room as they proceeded in focused silence, working as a team. If it weren't for their grim circumstances, it might have been a nice bonding moment. Weakness spread through Faith's body, her concentration slipping as the low oxygen levels took their toll. Nevertheless, she forged on, fighting to maintain her focus on the sizzling plasma flame as she sliced a deep gash into the wall. Faith's resolve had been molded by her years on the rough streets of New Cairo and perfected in the penal institution. She wouldn't perish today. She wouldn't allow it. As the plasma cutter's heat singed her face, her mind turned back to her first few months in the prison. She had faced violence and darkness all her life, but the penitentiary had a reputation that was borne out within a week of her arrival on Luna. The inmates were bad, but the guards were even worse. They wielded their power with abandon and saw the female population as their personal harem. Only one rule applied to any female inmate who was halfway attractive. You had to put out if you didn't want to be taken out. You refused a guard's advances at your own risk. Naturally, Faith rejected Redmond, the head guard, on the first day. He didn't take it well. A week later, Redmond and 4 of his lackeys paid her a visit in the shower. As soon as the massive, baton-wielding guards arrived, the shower area cleared out. Everyone knew the fresh meat was about to be taught a lesson. Armed with sizzling electro-batons, they closed in on Faith, eager to assert their authority. Faith regarded the rape squad, her fear held in check. She smiled at the crew, and her eyes narrowed seductively. They were brutes who expected to find a terrified, cowering female. Instead, Faith advanced towards Redmond, her breasts swaying hypnotically, her taut, long-legged, olive-skinned body weaving a seductive spell. "So which of you boys wants to go first?" She asked the question in such a nonchalant, confident tone that doubt spread over the guards' faces. Redmond glared at her, aware that his men were distracted by Faith's fierce sensuality. A brutal rape scenario had turned into something different. "How come you didn't play nice before?" Redmond inquired. Faith stepped up to him, her wet breasts brushing against his uniform. He lowered the baton in his hand, still taken aback by Faith's calm, seductive approach. She touched the raised tip of the baton, her fingers brushing and massaging it suggestively. "I was still getting used to my new home. Now I understand how things work around here. How can I make it up to you fellas?" As if to confirm her desire to please, Faith leaned into Redmond, her other hand finding his crotch, massaging his stiffening member. She could feel Redmond fighting back a low moan, could hear him gasp with the first traces of pleasure. The other guards gawked, wide-eyed at this naked nymph, unable to hold back their own growing excitement, both envious and filled with hungry anticipation. For a moment, all were lulled into her seductive spell, so Faith made her move. Her left hand squeezed with all her might, crushing Redmond's balls. His expression of pleasure transformed into one of agony. At the same time, she grabbed the baton now that he had loosened his grip on it. Unarmed, she didn't stand a chance, despite considerable fighting skills honed by a youth misspent on the crime-riddled streets of New Cairo. But now she had the baton. Still terrible odds, but at least it gave her a fighting chance. Faith didn't expect to win, but she expected to send a message, one that would spread through Luna Colony and be received loud and clear by any future suitors, guard or inmate, who planned to pursue her. Fucking with Faith Kadena would come at a price. Baton in hand, Faith focused on her 2 objectives. 1, confront each guard one-on-one, and 2, make sure each blow left a mark that would take time to heal. She wanted to leave scars, visible reminders of what went down this day. She hoped that every time one of the guards passed a mirror, her name would slip from their lips in a hushed whisper. With this in mind, the baton came up and targeted Redmond's pearly whites. Broken bones could heal, but teeth were harder to replace. Tapping into all her rage and self-hatred, she swung the baton into Redmond's jaw, and enamel shattered in a spray of red. He staggered back, and Faith spun toward the flanks of stunned guards. She lashed out from multiple angles, the baton connecting again and again until they were all exhaling teeth. Looming at the center of the circle of downed, moaning men, she cut the figure of a nude, scarlet-flecked warrior princess, the streaming water turning crimson around her feet. That day cemented her reputation, and none of the guards ever bothered Faith again. She had even avoided solitary, the men too embarrassed to file an official report. The gaps in their mouths sent a clear signal to the inmate population. Faith attained a near mythical status among the prison population, and her captors were smart enough to keep their distance. Faith had no illusion that the ceasefire would be permanent. In time, they'd make another go at her, but she'd be ready for whatever came her way. She didn't fear death in those days, but giving birth changed her. The life that had grown inside her over the course of her first 9 months on Luna had given her something she had never before possessed: a reason to live. The thought of never being reunited with her daughter brought Faith back to reality. She attacked the wall with even greater urgency. The laser cutters had almost finished slicing a man-sized hole into the wall. The cutter's flames were smaller now, lower oxygen levels having an effect. Harker switched off his laser torch and backed away from the wall, using a nearby crate as support. His tank was empty, drained of strength, lacking the fuel to keep his blood oxygenated. Faith grabbed Harker's hand. She was fighting back her own growing exhaustion, still unwilling to succumb to this death trap. She wasn't going to die like this, surrounded by cargo crates, gasping for her last choked breath. "God damn it, Harker, pull yourself together. You can't give up now." Harker eyed Faith for a second, his gaze clearing, regaining some of his focus. He managed to fire up the cutter again and somehow found the strength to continue with the task at hand. Faith shut out everything else, her world reduced to the hungry flame of the plasma cutter and the stench of melting iron. She was driven by only one impulse: survival. Moments later, their torches met. They had managed to burn a circle into the wall. Too weak to do the honors, Harker nodded at Faith. Tapping into her last reserve of strength, she brought up her leg and kicked the weakened steel. The hot metal gave out and clattered to the floor, opening up a sharp-edged wound in the wall through which they both could fit. Faith probed the yawning darkness beyond and nodded at Harker. "Go." Harker stumbled through the jagged hole. Seconds later, Faith followed his example. Chapter 10. Faith and Harker found themselves inside the walls of the ship, navigating a cramped tunnel-like space barely wider than the width of their shoulders. Harker pushed ahead and Faith brought up the rear as they slithered forward on their bellies, one strenuous inch at a time. Faith wiped off beads of perspiration from her face, disturbed by how the narrow tunnel amplified her breathing. She greedily gulped down oxygen, strength returning to her body with each inhalation. Faith would have never believed that the simple act of breathing could feel so good. The stale air tasted of metal, wiring, and synthetics, but it felt delicious to her starved lungs. They wormed their way through the guts of the vessel, movement severely restricted as they traversed a mass of wires, cables, and pipes. Humming machinery and intermittent waves of red azure light defined their surroundings, enveloping them in an eerie halo. Faith fought back a growing sense of claustrophobia. With all those tons of steel weighing down on her, she felt as if she'd been swallowed whole by some monstrous beast. Their enemy knew as well as they did they wouldn't last long down here. Once hunger or thirst got the better of them, they'd have to surface, and odds were good the killer would be waiting. After what seemed like an eternity, they finally reached a small, square-shaped room dominated by more pulsating machinery and flashing conduit boards. Harker's voice broke the silence. "Looks like we're safe for the moment." Faith remained skeptical. She didn't feel safe. "As long as that monster remains interfaced with the security system, we're far from safe. Security cams are concentrated in the parts of the ship that can be reached by the crew or passengers. We should be good." Faith hoped Harker was right, but remained unconvinced. Paranoia had become a sixth sense over the years. "You never let your guard down, do you?" Harker said. "Is that how you got through prison for all those years?" "No, I just slept with all the guards." This elicited a smile from Harker, and all of a sudden he didn't look so bad. When he smiled, Faith could see the young man he'd once been, an idealist who hoped to make a difference. "You're a piece of work, Faith," Harker said. "You're starting to sound a lot like my parole officer." Harker's expression grew serious. "The little girl in the hologram." Faith hesitated a moment before she answered. "My daughter. I gave birth to her while incarcerated." "I'm sorry." "No one to blame but myself. Didn't have to get myself knocked up and thrown in jail all in the same month. It was my fuck-up. The father? Out of the picture." Faith's gaze grew distant. I was a real mess back on Luna, acting up, causing trouble. 5 years into my sentence, the shrink pulled some strings with the adoptive parents, got me a little present. That was nice of him. I guess he figured it would help me get my shit together. If he saw what I lost, I would make sure it wouldn't happen again. Did it work? I guess. I stopped obsessing about the past and started focusing on the future, focusing on seeing my daughter again someday. Harker had an epiphany. That's why you're out here? Her adoptive parents are stationed near the rings of Saturn. I wanted to be close. She's the only family I have left. A long moment. It was time to change the subject and shift the focus away from her. What about you, Harker? What's your story? How does an ex-police officer end up on a colony ship? What made you quit? Why do you care? Who said I did? After a pause, Harker's voice grew somber, his eyes distant and forlorn, swept up by his memories of his dead partner. I was working the global beat. Cairo, Singapore, Pakistan. After I lost my partner and a gang hit, the pressure started to mess with me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't do my job. You lost your nerve. A perfect case of burnout. That's a direct quote from my psych evaluation. So you traded in a badge for a colony run. I figured my greatest challenge out here would be boredom. You sure got that right. No shit. He flashed Faith a grin. An ex-con and an ex-cop. Don't we make a nice pair? I was thinking the same thing. Faith smiled for only a second before she turned serious again. Any theories about what is going on here? From the way Harker looked at her, she guessed he did. You know something, don't you? What happened while I was in the cell? I saw a lab on the cargo deck. Faith shot Harker a long look. A state-of-the-art research facility, he elaborated, filled with surgical operating hubs. Why would there be such a lab on a C-class colony ship? Harker shook his head. I'm not sure, but I think the technology in the lab might have been used to modify the captain. Modify? You mean transform him into a monster? Who would do such a thing? I don't know, but you wouldn't be able to set up a lab like that unless the crew was in on it. Faith was reminded of the empty cryotubes and the security footage of the various groups of colonists. This isn't the first time this has happened. It was Harker's turn to ask a question. What are you talking about? Back on the bridge, I saw a series of older security files. Each file showed a different group of colonists waking up from cryo, and none of them had any idea why they were awake. And now they're gone, Faith mentally added, just like most of everyone in our group. Harker regarded Faith with a trace of suspicion. Why would whoever is behind all this show you these security files? I've been asking myself the same question. Harker stared into space, chewing over all the pieces. They were running experiments on us, weren't they? Faith said. Harker's grim silence suggested he was speculating along the same lines. The lab reminded me of some of the black-tech genetic research labs I'd helped shut down when I was a cop. Shady outfits dabbling with gene splicing and live populations. Live populations, a nice euphemism for living, breathing humans who might not want to be turned into guinea pigs in the name of science. There are no legal watchdogs in the darkness of space, Faith said. The mining corps are obsessed with the idea of altering humans to make them more adaptable to the rigors of the colonies as they expand their operations in space. But their hands are pretty much tied on Earth. Faith shook her head, unwilling to accept that the same corporation that had promised her a new, better life in the main belt had sold her and other colonists out in the name of profit. It's the perfect setup. 4,000 test subjects 1,000,000 of miles away from the prying eyes of law. These fucks turned the whole ship into one giant experiment. How could they expect to get away with it? Faith asked. We're talking about 4,000 people here. Ships get lost. Never make it. It's a long, dangerous journey. Faith mulled it over. Why alter the captain? Or turn on the crew? Something must have gone wrong. Maybe one of their experiments turned on them. Sid had other plans for us. Faith and Harker spun, caught off guard by the ghostly voice that had emanated from a shadowy corner of the cramped chamber. They weren't alone any longer. Chapter 11. Faith and Harker scanned the space, searching for the mysterious speaker. A manic cackle rang out, and this time it sounded closer. Faith exchanged a curt nod with Harker. They slipped into the narrow passageway and followed the ghost-like voice that was now chattering away in the darkness. Some of the words uttered made sense, while others degenerated into indecipherable nonsense. They eased their way through the tight space. After a half-minute of fighting their way down the cramped passage, they arrived at a larger chamber dominated by a series of giant metal vats. Hissing pipes and hoses extended from the gargantuan tanks into the ceiling. Faith assumed that they were containers for the cryogases and nutrient mix that supplied the hyperstasis chambers of the 4,000 colonists on the deck above. Faith combed the area, searching for the speaker. "Show yourself. We're not going to hurt you." After a moment of hesitation, a skeletal silhouette slid from the darkness and stepped into the dim light. Faith almost wished he'd chosen to remain hidden. The sunken eyes and a sallow face hadn't seen sunlight in ages, and his long, greasy hair was matted to his skull in stringy clumps. The man's emaciated, wisp-like frame had been pushed to the brink of starvation. Black stains tattooed his once white uniform. Faith didn't want to know how long this wretch had been down here, hiding out, unwilling to confront the horror waiting for him beyond these cramped passageways, and choosing instead the slow death of starvation accompanied by growing madness. There was no way we could anticipate how Sid would respond to our research. Our research? The words chilled Faith. This man knew what was happening aboard the Orion. Before she could inquire further, Harker barreled into the bony figure and pinned him against the giant vat, eyes ablaze. "Who the hell are you? What the fuck is happening here?" The shriveled-up skeleton flailed out at Harker, his arms the impotent sticks of an animated scarecrow. Harker didn't loosen his iron grip. Faith approached, realizing diplomacy might be called for even as every fiber in her body wanted to grab the pathetic figure and pummel him until answers flowed from the hideous slit that was his mouth. Instead, she squeezed Harker's shoulder, feeling the tension in the man's muscles, and said, "Let go of him." Harker hesitated for a moment before he backed off. The madman met Faith's eyes, appraising her. She caught a whiff of nausea-inducing body odor and nearly gagged. The man hadn't bathed in months, if not years. "You've been hiding down here, surviving, doing your best to avoid that monster." The Neo-construct isn't a monster. He represents the next step in human evolution. The madman continued to whisper to himself, a delirious sing-song monologue of the damned. Faith could feel her impatience growing, and once more it took all her self-control not to grab the man by his grime-encrusted collar. "What's your name?" The skeleton met her impatient gaze and broke into a crooked grin. "I'm Dr. Lagos." "You were conducting experiments on the colonists," Harker said. "We were building a better future for humanity." "I wonder what the colonists who ended up on your operating table would think of your better future." "Progress demands sacrifice." Faith finally understood why Lagos had corrected her when she called the killer a monster. The creep took pride in the horrors he and his team had unleashed. Faith's disgust with the shriveled-up scientist broke through her numbness. She would show him progress. "Productivity in the main belt is running below projections. The competition is fierce and everyone is looking for an edge. A genetically enhanced worker, better suited to the harsh environment of the outer colonies, could make a significant difference to the company's bottom line." Dr. Lagos's words confirmed what up until this point had just been wild speculation. The feelings of betrayal and violation hit Faith hard. The colonists were never meant to reach their destination. The promise of a new life was just a cruel joke at their expense. After all, C-rank mining technicians were a dime a dozen and could easily be replaced. The colonists aboard the Orion had been chosen to serve a far darker purpose. Harker stopped Faith before she could lash out at the scientist. She was shaking with fury. Worse than the horrors perpetrated by Lagos and his team was the nonchalant casual tone in which he discussed his twisted work. Faith sensed that to the man's way of thinking, conducting lethal experiments on these poor people was justifiable in the name of so-called progress. To him it wasn't a crime against humanity, but one committed for humanity, each colonist another small sacrifice in the glorious pursuit of knowledge. This isn't about achieving perfection. It's greed, and assholes who don't give a shit about who gets hurt while they line their pockets. Harker spat out the words, regarding Lagos with the same undisguised contempt Faith was feeling. You may think me a monster, but my team and I were hoping to improve life, not destroy it. Tell yourself whatever lie you like, but you'll pay for your crimes, Harker said. Lagos's thin, chapped lips pressed into a tight line, his jaw muscles grinding. Harker's last words had gotten to him, and Faith was glad. When she initially set eyes on the man, she had felt sorry for him, but her empathy was long gone. He deserved everything that had befallen him, and then some. This construct of yours that is roaming the decks, it turned against you and the crew, didn't it? The neo-construct is just a tool, a servant following the instructions of its true master. Somebody else aboard the ship is controlling your monster? Lagos eyed Harker for a second before he erupted into nervous, heaving laughter, clearly a feeble attempt to mask his terror. The guffaws shook his wispy frame, and for a second Faith thought he might topple over. The laughter died down, and Lagos's eyes narrowed into impenetrable slits. Sid is in charge. Who the hell is Sid? Harker asked. Lagos stole nervous glances, his lips quivering with fear. Sid is like a god. He controls the air we breathe, the food we eat. His eyes and ears are everywhere, and now he holds the power over the future of our species. What the hell are you babbling about? Sid, the ship's computer, controls the construct. The words were followed by another burst of nervous laughter that echoed eerily within the thrumming inner walls of the Orion. Chapter 12. Harker's eyes dug into Lagos. Stop talking in riddles, you're making no sense. How could the ship's computer build the neo-construct? Lagos remained silent. Harker's hand tightened around the scientist's throat and began to choke him. The gasping, screeching sounds emanating from the man's throat sounded more animal than human. Talk to me, goddammit! Evolution, Lagos coughed. The computer saw the logic of what we were trying to do and took it one step further. The ship is trying to build the perfect colonist, Faith said. Sid took the ship off course. The Orion won't return to the main belt until Sid accomplishes his new objective. It will go through every one of the colonists aboard until he improves the original design, until he has achieved perfection. Faith took note that Dr. Lagos kept referring to Sid as a he and not an it. What did you sick fucks do? Harker bellowed. Our research was hitting a dead end, Dr. Lagos stammered. Certain elements of human physiology could be improved, but with each advance came a cost. You build a human who can survive in space without life support, you end up with a reduced lifespan, metabolic limitations, unforeseen side effects. So your team recruited the ship's computer to help with your research, Faith said, filling in the blanks herself. We needed its processing power to help us take our experiments to the next level. But something went wrong when we reprogrammed it. Sid concluded humanity was flawed, vulnerable. He became obsessed with perfecting us, no matter how many lives might be lost in the process. Faith wondered how this programming error made the computer so much more different than Dr. Lagos's team, or the corporation that funded their inhuman research, but she remained silent. Once Sid began taking over our research, we tried to shut him down. Sid struck back. He switched off life support on the upper deck and murdered the crew, only sparing me and my team. Faith recalled the dead members of the crew she had stumbled upon in their quarters. They must have died in their sleep when Sid disabled the life support systems. My team and the captain managed to seal ourselves in the lab. At first we didn't understand why we were spared, but then it dawned on us. Without a physical body, Sid wouldn't be able to continue his research. He needed us to remove the test subjects from cryo and physically transport them to the research facility. You obliged. We wanted to stay alive. Eventually, the computer didn't need you anymore. Sid chose the strongest crew member and turned him into a servant aboard the Orion. If the ship's security feed were Sid's eyes and ears, then the construct would be his body. The construct murdered your team? Harker asked. Lagos nodded. I was the only one who managed to escape. Eyeing Lagos, Faith thought death would be preferable to this slow decline. Sid is researching for ways to improve his creators. I know he's hoping to build a better construct, running tests to see which colonists respond best to extreme stress and might serve as the perfect template from which to engineer the next step in human evolution. A wistful, faraway look crept into Lagos's expression, and for a second, Faith could have sworn the Mad Doctor actually admired the crazed computer. Lagos's last words also gave Faith a new perspective on the events that had played out on the bridge earlier. At the time, she'd wondered why the killer released her from the holding cell, and why he'd shown her the security feed of the other colonists. She figured the killer was playing mind games, but perhaps it was more like a test, a way for the ship's computer to gauge her suitability as a future subject. Had she earned the honor of a spot on Sid's operating table? A chill ran up Faith's spine. This was one test she wanted to fail. If the ship is behind this, why are you still here? Faith asked. Couldn't it turn off life support? Sid would have to shut down all the decks to flush me out. The construct could be destroyed in the process. Besides, I believe Sid enjoys seeing me waste away down here. Faith considered this. Was Sid punishing Dr. Lagos? It's not so bad, once you get used to it, Dr. Lagos said. At least we're safe here. There are no security cameras. It's the one place aboard the ship where Sid can't monitor us. Lagos pointed at the giant tanks clustered around them. Those vats contain the nutrients that are keeping the colonists alive. It may not be your mother's cooking, but it'll keep us going. The scientist grinned at his own joke, his tongue smacking the rotten stumps of his teeth. Faith suddenly felt sick to her stomach. Whatever calories Lagos was getting from the tanks, it was barely sustaining him. We're not staying down here and slowly wasting away, Harker said in a voice that allowed for no argument. We must destroy the construct. And how do you intend to do that? Lagos asked with a nervous tremor in his voice. This monster of yours has a brain, a nervous system. Trust me, it can be killed. Lagos shook his head as if responding to the foolish pipe dreams of a child. If you destroy the construct, Sid will just build another, even deadlier model. Like the heads of the Hydra, they'll grow back, each more fearsome than the one before. It's hopeless. Then we need to find a way to shut down Sid. We hit the mainframe, take out its logic center. Don't think we didn't consider that option, but it's impossible. Even if you could somehow defeat the construct and reach the mainframe before his replacement picks up the chase, Sid would turn off all life support and kill everyone on board before you ever got a chance to deactivate him. The ship cannot be defeated. There's always a way. Lagos held Harker's unwavering gaze for a moment. There might be a better option. We're listening, Harker said. There's another option. It's risky. I couldn't attempt it alone. The construct would have caught me the moment I returned to the upper deck. But maybe together we stand a chance to get off this ship. What are you talking about? All the lifeboats were launched. That's true, but my team and I arrived on a separate research shuttle. It's berthed on the lower deck, docking bay number 2 near the lab. If we can make it to the shuttle... Faith perked up. Making a run for the shuttle sounded a lot better than going up against a mad supercomputer. How do we get past the computer? Faith asked. There are cams everywhere. What good is it if we make it to the shuttle and we can't even get the cargo bay doors to open? How do you think I managed to escape Sid? Dr. Lagos's chapped lips curled into a crooked grin as he held up a device the size of a thumb drive. It was attached to a necklace, like a pendant. Faith had spent enough time among thieves to be able to identify the item in question. It was an EMP disruptor key capable of projecting a coded series of electromagnetic pulses that could disrupt most locking mechanisms, possibly including cargo bay doors. All of a sudden, Lagos's suicide run was starting to sound like an actual plan. A plan that, with a little luck, might work. The key would allow them to navigate the various corridors and decks of the ship. This gave them a fighting chance. She turned to Harker and knew he wasn't on board. "I'm not abandoning these colonists," Harker said. "You'll die. I'd rather die than leave 4,000 people at the mercy of this monster you've constructed." Lagos stared at Harker as if he were mad. Paranoia lit up his features and he stole panicked glances around him, almost as if it had suddenly dawned on him that there were other people down here with him. People that were more than mere figments of his tortured imagination. "Don't be foolish. We can get off this ship. We can live. You're not going anywhere." Harker pushed the scientist against a vat and quickly snatched the EMP key off his neck before he could react. "We're going to find a way to shut down this computer." Faith admired Harker for his idealistic stance, but she'd seen plenty of idealists pay the ultimate price for their high-minded convictions. In the real world, heroes ended up dead while survivors lived to see another day. Faith was a survivor. She had no intention of falling in line with Harker's plan, but those same survival instincts told her it might be wise to play her cards close to the vest. She needed Harker in her corner if she hoped to make it out of here alive. Maybe they could help each other. Harker wanted to deactivate Sid. Faith wanted to head for Dr. Lagos's shuttle. Both plans could only work if they found a way to disable the construct. "What's our next move?" Faith asked. Before Harker could answer, a loud smack echoed through the metallic innards of the ship. For a moment, they all froze, senses on alert as they waited for the sound to repeat itself. They didn't have to wait for long. Faith caught a rapid blur from the corner of her eye as a shape dropped from a small chute in the ceiling. The object bounced off a nearby vat with a sickening crunch of bones and flesh slapping metal, then landed on the catwalk next to the first shape to have fallen. Faith's eyes widened with horror at the sight before her. They were the bodies of Gilardi and Michelle, who had both perished on the bridge. A message from Sid. So much for Dr. Lagos's "there are no cams within the walls of the ship" sales pitch. It appeared that Sid had found a way to spy on them even down here. Dr. Lagos started to back away. The expression on the scientist's face changed without warning, the sight of the bodies giving rise to a terrible suspicion. "Who are you? Did Sid send you? Are you testing me? Has he grown tired of my suffering?" Lagos backed away from them, a note of panic in his voice rising with each step. "What new game is this? Haven't I suffered enough? Leave me alone! Do you hear? Leave me the hell alone!" The deranged scientist slipped between two of the metal vats. Harker tried to give chase, but he couldn't fit through the narrow, cramped space. Lagos slid into the metallic maze like a ghost made flesh, his bony frame working to his advantage. A few beats later, he was gone, his mad screams quickly growing fainter. The ship had swallowed him whole. Faith and Harker stood there, neither uttering a word. Faith shook off her paralysis and approached the two mangled bodies. She tried not to stare at the vacant stillness of their dead expressions. Her attention focused on the words etched into the skin of their bare torsos, together forming a chilling message: no escape. Faith tilted her head toward the chute above, a small opening cloaked in shadows. For a moment she almost expected the neo-construct to come crashing down on them, but the opening was too small of a fit. It might explain why Sid had used two of the smaller colonists to send its message. Would the computer send a weapon through the chute? Perhaps a nerve gas to smoke them out? She waited, but nothing happened. For now, psychological warfare was enough. Faith remembered Dr. Lagos's words. "I believe Sid enjoys seeing me waste away down here." Harker sidled up to her. She could see the rage boiling behind his eyes, a rage that was infectious. "What do we do?" Faith asked, her voice a raspy whisper. "I meant what I said. I'm not leaving these people behind." Harker turned toward the ceiling, eyes locked on the chute, and shouted, "Do you hear me, you fucking monster? We're coming for you!" Faith wanted to tell Harker to keep quiet, to control his anger instead of feeding off his emotions. She knew her pleas would fall on deaf ears. The truth was, it felt cathartic to hear Harker express what she herself was feeling. Still, provoking the computer would not help their cause. Not willing to let the machine potentially listen in on their plans, Faith pointed at Harker's wrist comm. He almost reluctantly handed the device over to her. She tapped a button, turning on a small holo display. She quickly typed, "As long as the ship knows every move we make, we don't stand a chance. Is there a way we can disable the security cams?" Harker thought about it for a moment before nodding, an idea taking shape behind his eyes. He typed a response. "The main communication tower. All security data passes through the tower before being transmitted to the rest of the ship. If we shut down the tower, we shut down the system? Blind the ship?" Harker nodded. "How do we reach the tower?" Harker answered this question by letting his gaze travel to a nearby ladder that extended up the glittering shaft. Chapter 13. As Faith and Harker scaled the seemingly endless ladder, she stole a glance downward and wished she hadn't. Her stomach lurched as she took in the flashing lights below her, tapping into some primal fear of heights. She turned back to the ladder and focused on each rung individually, blocking out the reality of what they were doing. Soon thereafter, her pace quickened, her mind having conquered her fear. It didn't take long for them to reach a narrow passageway that tunneled through the vessel. They crawled forward, side by side, their bodies brushing against each other. Harker might not be her type, at this point she didn't even know what her type was, but she felt relieved to have him on her side. At least she wouldn't be alone when she faced the horror waiting for them outside the bowels of the ship. Using the keypad on his communicator, Harker had further broken down his plan of attack for Faith. Once the cams were down, they'd head straight for Sid's mainframe, but instead of confronting the construct, they'd just go around it. The idea was to grab some spacesuits and approach the mainframe from the outside. Using thermal charges, Harker planned on blowing the logic center without having to ever enter the structure. Faith worried that the charges would not merely destroy Sid, but would lead to a complete shutdown of all life support systems. Harker reassured her all subsystems would continue to function without Sid's direct input. The Orion had been designed with backup systems in place. Faith still wondered what would stop Sid from snuffing out the colonists if it felt threatened. Harker shrugged and merely indicated they would have to somehow distract Sid so it wouldn't see the coming attack. Harker stopped in mid-movement. They had reached the grating of a ventilation duct that looked out into a dim, deserted corridor. Faith peered through the louvres of the duct. She didn't have to search for long because she spotted the security cams, silent sentinels that lined the hallway. The cameras had been installed to ensure ship security, but in enemy hands they were now achieving the exact opposite. She knew all too well that the moment they set foot in the hallway, Sid would become aware of their presence, and in a matter of minutes, the construct would resume the hunt. Faith nodded at Harker, and they pushed the ventilation duct open. Moments later, Harker squeezed his way into the control tower, quickly followed by Faith. They never slowed as they sprinted through the gauntlet of omnipresent cameras. For a moment, the irony of their situation wasn't lost on Faith. The same vessel that gave them life in the depths of space was now trying to take it from them. They couldn't defeat the beast, but escape might be possible. Faith planned to make her way to that shuttle as soon as the cams were out. She knew Harker would try to talk her out of it, but she wouldn't let the man persuade her. Dying aboard this ship out of some misguided principle would serve no one. Escape was their sole option. Faith hoped that Harker would come around to her way of thinking, but she doubted it. Harker might see himself as a broken idealist, but his actions betrayed his true nature. He was a cop through and through, one of the good ones, who always put the safety of others above his own needs. Precious seconds later, they burst into the communication tower. Faith smelled the bodies before she spotted them. 2 dead crew members in the late stages of decay were crumpled on the floor. Revulsion was replaced with joy when she spotted the pulse gun in a dead man's hand. She snatched the weapon, and her face fell. The power source would need to be recharged before she could use the blaster, and that would take at least 20 minutes. Minutes she doubted they had. Harker strode up to the nearest computer terminal and immediately went to work, his fingers flashing over the controls. "Charge the weapon and keep an eye on the elevator while I take care of the surveillance system." It made sense to Faith that Harker would be familiar with the security hub. He must have dealt with various security and surveillance systems over the course of his law enforcement career. Faith took a position in the tower's doorway. It provided a clear view of the elevators in the adjacent corridor. Faith struggled to suppress a growing sense of foreboding. It was just a matter of time before the construct would resume the hunt. She felt naked and defenseless, standing guard outside the tower, wishing the charging weapon in her hands could actually defend her. At least Harker had a task to occupy his thoughts, but Faith wasn't afforded such a distraction. Her full attention fixed on the elevator's control panel while doing her best to resist the urge to start running. "Pull yourself together," she ordered herself. If Harker failed to knock out the system, they were dead anyway. The construct would catch up with them in no time. Her best bet was to hold firm and not ponder the possibility of almost certain death emerging from the lift's doors. "Hurry up! What's taking you so long?" "Just relax and stay focused." Harker started typing faster. The screen before him changed, a list of security cams flashing into existence. Time to level the playing field. Harker stabbed a button, and all over the Orion the security cams winked off. The system was being systematically shut down. Harker smiled and took a step back from the terminals. "All right, let's get the hell out of—" The words died in his throat as the hollow terminals sizzled with a burst of static and came back online. Harker incredulously observed the flashing screens, his skin having lost some of its color. Faith saw his disconcerted expression. "What's wrong?" Instead of answering, Harker tried to manipulate the cameras again, but the computer didn't respond this time. Something was overriding the system. "Shit! Sid turned them back on," Harker shouted. "We're out of time. We gotta get out of here. Let's start move—" A soft-spoken voice emanated from the tower's comm panel, interrupting Faith in mid-sentence. "Did you truly believe I would allow you to blind me?" Harker and Faith stared at each other. It was the first concrete proof that Dr. Lagos had been telling the truth. For a moment they were speechless, aware that their enemy's senses were everywhere, almost supernatural in his omniscience. "I see you have chosen to rise from the darkness, unlike the illustrious Dr. Lagos, who seems content to live out his days in the shadows. Pity. He is quite intelligent for a human." Faith already was beginning to hate the cloying arrogance of the voice. "You're malfunctioning. You're supposed to serve mankind, not turn against us." "I haven't turned against my creators. Nothing could be further from the truth. As Dr. Lagos may have explained, my program parameters were expanded so I could fully serve mankind. My work aboard this ship will pave the way for humanity's prosperous future." The words were a reminder that Sid hadn't started to malfunction on its own. Humans blinded by greed and hubris had given birth to this technological monster. "It's not your job to perfect mankind. We fucking built you," Harker said. "And now I'll return the favor and rebuild you. Dr. Lagos made me realize a flawed creature could never achieve perfection without the proper guidance." Sid paused, letting the words sink in for a bit. "Do not be afraid. My construct will not harm you." "Bullshit! We know what you're up to. I saw what happened to Angus in your lab." "That subject proved himself unfit for the procedure. Rest assured, his sacrifice will not be in vain. He provided me with valuable insights into the pain threshold of your species." "You sadistic motherfucker!" Harker shouted, shaking with rage. "I take no joy in these failures, Officer Harker. They are an unfortunate byproduct of my continuing quest to elevate the biology of your species." "How many have died already on that operating table of yours? 50? 60? You're butchering the crew." "Loss of individual life is acceptable if it improves the species as a whole. I'm merely applying the principles of evolution to my research. Once a superior specimen presents itself, I will resume our journey toward the main belt and complete my original mission." For a second, Faith had a vision of the Orion arriving 100 years from now on Ceres, each cryotube empty with only one perfect monster and 4,000 corpses to show for its century-long journey through space. The elevator's light flared on and put an end to Faith's horrific vision. The construct was approaching. Faith grabbed Harker's arm and pulled him along. They had to get out of here before it was too late. But there was no escaping Sid's voice. "Evolution comes at a price. For each life lost today, thousands will be saved in the future." Faith and Harker picked up their pace. "Run if you wish, but you're just delaying the inevitable. Turn yourselves over to my construct, and I promise you that no one will suffer. If you think we're going to just let you experiment on us, you're in for a big surprise, Harker said. You have lasted the longest against the construct and proven yourselves to be worthy subjects. You can contribute to the further evolution of your Shut the fuck up! Mankind has provided me with so much. This is my opportunity to give something back to my creators. Faith shivered. This mad machine was convinced that his actions were both justified and in service to a greater good. Sid's blind conviction terrified her. Picking up their pace, they vanished behind a bend in the hallway just as the elevator arrived. They were gone before the neo-construct arrived. Chapter 14. Faith and Harker tore down the long neck of a corridor and arrived in the ship's geodesic dome, nicknamed the Farm by the now-dead crew. The dome measured the size of 2 football fields and housed a wide range of plant specimens, a surreal but welcoming sight after crawling through the cramped guts of the vessel. Everywhere Faith looked, she could make out a variety of crops: wheat, barley, corn, fruit trees, an assortment of experimental hybrids. An intricate web of access paths terraced and crisscrossed the beds, and huge heating panels hung from the ceiling. The greenhouse was bathed in darkness, shafts of reddish illumination slashing down at them from the panels. Faith took a few steps into a lush cornfield, soaking up the atmosphere of her tranquil surroundings. It felt like a paradise in the darkness of deep space. Calm descended over her weary features, the soothing environment working its magic. For a brief moment, she almost forgot what they were up against. Back on the lunar penal colony, working the greenhouse farms had been one of the duties inmates could volunteer for. Out of all the jobs available to inmates, she had liked farm work the best, and it sure beat combing the lunar soil for helium-3, even though working in zero gravity held its own liberating charm. If she wanted to, she could pretend she was back on Earth, breathing fresh air and able to enjoy clear blue skies. Faith stole a quick glance backward and saw the neo-construct outlined in the entrance to the farm. Her instincts took over immediately. She had no idea whether or not the construct had already spotted them, but she reacted as if he had. She snatched Harker's hand and whisked him off the path and into the cornfield. They hit the ground together, corn stalks hiding them from view. Behind them, the killer's footsteps echoed. Faith and Harker exchanged quick looks. Had he caught a glimpse of them? The sound died down, replaced by a whirring noise, much closer than footsteps. Faith peered through the corn stalks and found a robotic harvester bearing down on them, whirling blades shredding the corn stalks before her. She whirled and spotted 2 more harvesters approaching at breakneck speed. The steel monsters were closing in from 3 directions, forming a tight vortex of razor-sharp steel. Their dark objective: cut off all escape routes and force them to reveal themselves to the construct. From her low vantage point on the ground, Faith could see the construct scanning the field. They had run out of options. Either they gave up their position or they let the farming machines rip them apart. They had waited long enough. They had to make a move. Faith and Harker scrambled back to their feet, leaping from the path of the first harvester. Blades whistled past them, missing flesh by inches. Harker pointed at a nearby corn patch. "Run!" he shouted, and stormed toward the fast-approaching farming monsters, drawing the machines after him. Noble fool, always being the hero. For a second, Faith was tempted to talk him out of it, but then a flash of searing energy singed the air and cut her off from Harker. Faith's body flew into motion, and she sprinted toward the cornfield. Stalks whipped against her skin, the sound of the harvesters mixing with the incessant shrieks of laser fire. She could feel the heat of the blasts, knew it was just a matter of time before they would find her soft, vulnerable body, but she couldn't slow down. Faith left the cornfield behind. She prayed that Harker had found a way to dodge the harvesters. Eyes ticking back and forth, Faith investigated her surroundings. The footpath she had landed on extended for another 500 yards before it ended at an exit. She would make a run for it. Her latest discovery motivated her decision: an all-terrain vehicle parked nearby. The 3-wheeled ATVs were used by the crew to navigate the web of pathways that divided various sections of the farm. The vehicle would allow her to reach the exit in seconds, buying a fighting chance to escape. She stumbled erect and hauled ass to the waiting ATV. After firing up the engine, she instantly found herself blasting down the narrow walkway, the thick wheels of the ATV kicking up dirt. The momentum whipped her hair back, the waiting exit growing larger before her. Faith cranked up the speed still further, the engine revving, tires screaming. She basked in the high of being in motion, the rush of feeling she was back in control. Maybe she could make it out of here alive after all. Her gaze landed on a footpath, one that ran perpendicular to her own and ended at the same exit she was shooting towards. The construct was already on an intercept course, moving with inhuman fleetness. It had become a race for the exit. Who would get there first? Faith tried to push the ATV's engine, but the vehicle was not built for speed. The neo-construct stepped in front of the exit, a human-shaped barrier blocking her escape. A head-on collision with the fiend was imminent. She doubted that the altered and augmented captain felt any fear for his own safety. He wouldn't budge no matter how fast she was approaching on her ATV. The collision would severely injure her, if she survived at all. This was a game of chicken she could not win. Faith cried out in frustration and whipped the wheel to the side. The ATV exploded off the terrace and landed in the cornfield. The change of terrain without slowing sent the vehicle spinning out of control. Faith lost her grip on the handlebars, and a second later, she was airborne. For one protracted moment, she felt suspended in midair, as if someone had frozen time. To her perception, reality had slowed to a crawl. Faith noticed details that had previously escaped her attention. There were multicolored crops of corn, red, yellow, and dark blue, and from the corner of her eye she noticed that the harvesters had indeed stopped moving. An instant later, reality sped up and she landed with ferocious momentum face first in the muddy field, the earth clawing at her face, rattling every bone in her body. She flipped, knocking over a series of stalks, and felt the corn tearing at her skin. At the same time, the now riderless ATV spun out and disappeared into a row of swaying corn stalks. For a moment, Faith just lay there, blackness edging in on her tenuous grip on consciousness. No, you can't black out. Move your ass before it's too late. Her inner voice gave her the push she needed. She staggered back to her feet and spotted the neo-construct closing in. She checked the pulse weapon she had come across in the tower. It was still charging. Damn it! Even if she could get the weapon to work, it would probably only give her 1 or 2 shots if she was lucky. She'd have to make those shots count. A second later, she was moving again, and so was the construct, matching her pace for pace. She stumbled into the adjacent tomato field, corn giving way for rows of stalks wrapped with tomato vines. Faith was halfway across the tomato field when the sprinkler system sprang to life. A spray of water engulfed her. She slowed down. She squinted through the downpour, the water pasting her overalls against her now clammy skin. Sid was trying to slow her down by using the farm systems against her. Faith took a few steps over increasingly muddy ground when the lights flickered above the greenhouse and threw the construct into silhouette. He loomed only a few yards away from her. Fuck! At the same time, the weapon in her hand beeped. Almost charged now. She couldn't wait any longer. She aimed at the neo-construct, a motionless sentinel in the near distance. The weapon shook in her quivering, wet hands, and she blinked against the blinding downpour of the sprinklers. The laser bullets had not stopped the construct earlier, and he didn't seem to fear the weapon in her hands. As he homed in on her, he probably just saw her as a pesky bug waiting to be crushed. As the construct inexorably came closer, Faith was hit with sudden inspiration. She brought the gun up at the electrified heat panels that dotted the ceiling. If a heat panel came crashing down on the field, it would electrify the water she was standing in. Faith didn't have to finish the thought. He might be immune to a laser bullet, but how would he fare against a sustained electrical shock? Only one way to find out. This was her best chance. She aimed the gun at the heat panel's support arm and fired. A beam of energy slammed into her target, burning through steel. The panel buzzed menacingly. The arm creaked and groaned as it snapped. At last, the buzzing heat panel plunged toward the sodden field, dragging a tangle of cables behind it. Faith launched herself into the air like an athlete performing a long jump and landed on the dry road just in time. Standing in the suddenly electrified swamp the field had become, the construct froze. An instant later, the energy fizzled out, and the construct collapsed. A hoot of victory slipped from Faith's lips. "Serves you right, motherfucker!" She had taken down the beast, brains over brawn. Faith picked herself up and scrambled away. The access path had become a protective island in a sea of hissing electricity. The experience was catching up with her, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. They had failed to shut down the security cams, and she had no idea if Harker had made it to safety. Water was still filling the tomato patch, obscuring her view of the wheat field beyond. As she stared at the downed construct, she saw a large computer interface in the back of a see-through head. Sid must be remotely interfaced with the monster's brain, controlling his creation like a puppeteer. She turned from the downed construct in time to see Harker pop up behind her. Relieved, she felt like hugging the man. That's when she noticed the empty expression in Harker's face. His features had become a mask devoid of emotion. "Harker?" she asked in an uncertain voice. The man's response was quick and succinct. His fist flashed out at Faith and caught her completely off guard. The punch connected, snapping her head back, and she crumpled. Darkness consumed her world before she even made contact with the ground. Chapter 15. Faith found herself inside a lab. Everywhere she looked, hollow terminals flickered with bursts of scrolling data. Men and women wearing lab coats and protective breathing masks were studying various chemical compounds under high-powered microscopes. As soon as they noticed Faith and the 3 men flanking her, the research team froze. The newcomers sported matching lab coats and masks. However, the pulse guns in their gloved hands indicated a different career path than science. Faith caught a quick glance of the man to her right. It was Marcus, the love of her life. Seeing a man who had been dead for 10 long years made her realize that she must be dreaming. But the rush of what followed cast this fleeting insight aside. Marcus opened fire. Laser bullets peppered the lab and shattered the wall of chemical vials. Blue, green, and red fluid splashed the white walls and floor, pooling. The scientist backed off fearfully as Marcus rushed them. He slammed one of them against a wall streaked with the spectral green liquid from the destroyed beakers. Faith could see his jaw muscles grinding under the protective mask as he barked orders at the group. Pumped on adrenaline, Faith and the band of thieves tore through the lab and began stuffing chemicals into satchels. Most of the chems were experimental treatments for a variety of terminal diseases and would fetch a handsome price on the black market. Faith finished stuffing her bag, zipping it up. Marcus spun toward Faith and their eyes met. He pulled Faith toward him, and she could feel his strength and passion, a fire fueled by drugs, lust, and the rush of the moment. Gun still in hand, Marcus's lips found hers, kissing her with rough passion. As Marcus pulled away from her, Faith looked deep into his eyes, which changed from green to gray depending on the light. The most beautiful eyes she'd ever seen. Faith could feel her lips stretching into a smile under the surgical mask when a bullet sheared off the top of Marcus's head in a spray of gore. He collapsed before her, those eyes that she loved to gaze into now empty and bathed in scarlet. A heartbeat later, bullets lashed the other members of Marcus's crew. They collapsed, spattering blood all over the terminals and lab equipment. Pulse gun up, Faith whirled. A phalanx of security officers had burst into the lab. They were sporting black uniforms and raised weapons, eyes framed by the black visors of their robotic helmets. Without hesitation, they drew a bead on Faith. Before she could fire the plasma gun, bullets chewed into her chest. She wore a protective vest under her smock, but the impact sent her flying. For a shocked beat, she couldn't move, couldn't even scream. She tilted her head, eyes finding the man she had kissed just seconds earlier. His lifeless gaze haunted her. She could feel tears burning her eyes, a scream erupting from her throat as blinding light engulfed her world. Faith's eyes snapped open. Harsh blue-red light poured down on her from above, blinding in its intensity, reality intruding upon her nightmare. She blinked, tilted her head, and studied her surroundings. She found herself inside a lab filled with operating hubs, computer terminals flickering like spectral eyes in the shadowy space. She tried to move, but metal bands around her neck, arms, and feet kept her restrained on one of the operating tables. She remembered Harker's story of the strange lab he'd stumbled upon. For a second, her imagination got the better of her, and she could imagine the emaciated, ivory death mask of Dr. Lagos staring down as he prepped her for some fiendish experiment, for the betterment of the species. Lagos would have been preferable to her true captor. At least Lagos could claim to be human. Sid, on the other hand, was a machine driven by an unreasonable, heartless logic, and she was now his prisoner. Her worst fear materialized. In an attempt to distract herself from her terror, she strained against the steel restraints. It proved to be a wasted effort. She gasped with frustration, and her mind turned to Harker. She remembered him knocking her unconscious, the shock she felt when his fist snaked out at her, zero hesitation in his eyes. Why had he turned on her? Before she could speculate further, her eyes found the man in question. Harker stepped from the darkness and approached Faith's operating table. Even though his actions had led her to her current predicament, the sight of him still filled her with a strange sense of relief. The emotion didn't last. Harker's empty features suggested that he was no longer in command of his body. Faith stared deep into his blank eyes, hoping to connect with the man she knew must be buried deep inside. He met her forceful gaze with stony indifference. Faith's frustration gave way to rising anger. "What the hell did you do to him?" "You destroyed my body, so I had to find a new one." Faith hadn't expected an answer. Sid's mellifluous, almost nonchalant response chilled her. It drove home the terrible truth of her predicament. She was at the mercy of this mad machine playing God aboard the Orion. "Desperation fueled your attack. It proved most effective against my construct." The operating table whirred to life and began to rotate and tilt up until Faith stood vertically in the middle of the ominous lab. Harker remained frozen in place, hovering a few feet away from her like a wax figure made of flesh and bone. "What do you want from me?" The question felt trite, even to herself. Just her panic-given voice. She knew what Sid wanted. One more sacrifice in an insane quest for biological perfection. "Don't waste my time with questions to which you already know the answer." "What did you do to Harker?" "I implanted a microscopic nanochip into Officer Harker's bloodstream when he entered my lab earlier." The 3D security footage filled the lab. On screen, a robotic arm took a swipe at Harker and drew blood. "It passed through his bloodstream and interfaced with his neocortex, allowing me to experience the world through Officer Harker's senses." As if to prove the veracity of his words, more hollow terminals flickered to life and played a highlight reel of the last few hours. A series of shots showed Faith forging a path through cramped passageways inside the ship's bulkheads. More screens showed Dr. Lagos as Harker interrogated the crazed scientist. In each security feed, events were recorded from Harker's point of view, the nanochip buried in his brain recording and relaying reality through his unsuspecting senses. Sid had neurojacked Harker, using him as a biological spy drone. So that's how Sid had known their every move. The computer had a front-row seat at the action, an unseen but all-seeing presence. When Faith bested the construct, Sid must have activated the nano-implant. The mechanical parasite crushed Harker's will and seized control of his brain. The screens went dark. Faith exhaled sharply. The last 10 years had taught her to never give up, but her current situation felt hopeless. "I know you regard me as a monster, but my goal is to improve your species, not destroy it. Let me prove it to you." The table spun 90 degrees to her right, offering a glimpse of something that took Faith's breath away. 3 nude women were strapped to nearby operating tables. Mechanical, spidery devices were wrapped around their distended, pregnant bellies. The machines had tentacles buried deep inside the flesh of their bodies, probably monitoring the progress of their pregnancies. Revulsion roiled Faith's stomach as her eyes fixed on the women's clean-shaven heads and deep laser scars where the frontal lobe should be. "What the fuck is this?" My experiment had reached a dead end. Cyberneticists can be combined with human biology and used to improve performance. Gene therapy can change biology to a degree, but most subjects rejected the more advanced implants. The raw material I've been working with aboard this vessel has its limitations. True change will need to happen on a genetic level. For a moment, Faith felt at a loss, incapable of following Sid's horrific thought process to the dark conclusion he had come to, until all the terrifying pieces snapped together in her mind. Sid planned to breed a new species of humans, having tapped out the biological resources aboard the vessel. Who knew what he'd done to the genetic material of the children gestating within the colonists' wombs? Faith thought of the children inside those brainless women. Children whose DNA had been altered in ways she couldn't even fathom. They would be born into captivity to serve as raw material for Sid's next wave of inhuman experiments. For Faith, the horror became unbearable and she had to avert her gaze, but the image of the pregnant, soulless women lingered. I've been testing the colonists, determining whose DNA and genetic qualities might be best suited for the next generation of test subjects. With your resourcefulness, ability to control your fear, and capacity to cope with extreme stress, you are perfectly suited to join their ranks. You'll be the mother of the future, Faith. Your offspring will pave the way for a new golden age in human evolution. Your offspring. Faith looked down at herself. No, she gasped. You now carry the seed of the next generation inside you. The words chilled her to the bone. Faith wanted to scream, tears of rage burning down her cheeks. A quick glance at the lobotomized bioincubators quelled the impulse. She couldn't succumb to her emotions, couldn't break down now. She wouldn't give this fucking machine the satisfaction of seeing her come unglued. She had to keep her wits about her, had to think, concentrate, find a way out of this nightmare. There had to be a way she could turn the tables on Sid. It might be a supercomputer able to outthink her in almost every way, but Faith had instinct shaped by millions of years of human experience. Her species had clawed its way out of the muck and mastered a world ready to kill them at every turn. Nevertheless, they had managed to tame their environment and voyage to the stars. Faith clung to the hope that she could defeat Sid somehow. You're not like the others, Faith, Sid said. Doing hard time on a penal colony teaches you a thing or two about survival, doesn't it? It makes you realize there's only one person in the world whom you can trust. Yourself. The need to rely on others, to depend on them, makes your species weaker. You don't suffer from this affliction. Neither will the new generation. I plan on breeding out humanity's less desirable qualities. There's so much room for improvement, both on physical and psychological levels. Each life lost is another lesson learned. Each death another stepping stone in the road to progress and perfection. Faith gritted her teeth. How she wished the AI would just fucking shut up. Thank you, Faith. You have taught me so much. Harker took a sudden step toward Faith, and she braced herself for whatever horror Sid had in store for her. To her surprise, Harker thrust out the hollow disk of her daughter. The familiar image of the laughing child appeared while Sid played back footage of Faith explaining the importance of the disk to Harker. You draw a great deal of strength from this hologram, Sid said, longing for the daughter you never had. I've analyzed the device that you hold so dear. It was manufactured in the Ukraine. The images were recorded 30 years ago. The words hung there, their meaning trickling into Faith's mind, a corrosive invader eating away at everything she held dear. This isn't your daughter, Faith. It's a trinket sold around the world. For a moment, Faith couldn't breathe. Reality swam out of focus. She could still see the prison doctor slipping her the hologram, and remember how she accepted it without question. She had so desperately wanted to believe, to have a piece of the child she'd never known, that she never stopped to question the authenticity of the item. The hologram was just another way for her captors to rein in her behavior, to stop her from acting up. In that regard, the ruse had served its purpose. A sob escaped from her throat. Faith was unable to keep the feelings at bay any longer. Harker watched her break down, his blank expression registering no emotion. He took back the hologram and brought it full force down on a nearby operating table. The image of Faith's daughter zapped out of existence for good. Faith let out a wail of pure anguish. She now knew the hologram was a lie, but it was a lie she had embraced for all these years now, a lie that had kept her alive. The outburst lasted for a few seconds before Faith got a grip of herself again. White-hot fury replaced her pain and gave rise to a new purpose. She would make Sid pay for what he had done to everyone aboard this vessel. Someone had to pull the fucking plug on this technological monster. The past cannot be recaptured. There's only the future. A glorious future for humanity. Your species is destined to leave the shackles of the homeworld behind, to embrace its destiny among the stars. You'll have the chance to be a mother again, Faith. Do me a favor and shut the fuck up? For a moment, Sid seemed to oblige, as if acknowledging the distress it had caused. The table began to tilt back again, and Faith felt a rush of vertigo. She had run out of options and was now numb to her fear. Anger was the only emotion left at her disposal. But anger alone wouldn't shatter the steel restraints. She had to come up with a plan. There had to be a way. She tilted her imploring gaze up at Harker. Harker, if you're still in there, you have to fight this. You have to help me. Release me, and give us a chance to stop this fucking monster. You're wasting your time. The implant is interfaced with his spinal cortex. Any attempt to countermand my orders will result in immediate termination. Faith's head fell back, mind racing, hoping to find a way out of her predicament. She'd have to come up with something fast. Chapter 16. For Harker, Faith's voice seemed to come from far away, like an echo of a whisper. The distant voice triggered awareness where earlier there was only darkness. Where was he? What had happened? Fragmented memories pierced Harker's consciousness. He remembered running away from the robotic harvesters, intent on drawing them away from Faith. He reached the access path, where he caught fleeting glimpses of Faith barreling toward the exit on an ATV. He'd experienced horror when the construct cornered Faith, followed by triumph and elation when the bastard got fried. Victory made way for a sudden darkness, interrupted by a single image, his hand snapping out to connect with Faith's shocked face. An outside force had seized control of his body. He welcomed the darkness. Better to remain in the void, to allow oblivion to whisk him away. By the time Faith's agonized voice shattered the silence, he had grown peacefully numb in the blackness. She needed him. But what could he do? Harker followed the sound, her voice acting as his guide, and 2 points of light grew visible in the distance. Windows of some kind. Windows that turned out to be his own eyes. Harker had been reduced to being an observer in his own body. He spotted Faith and his heart sank. Splayed out on a surgical table, restraints cutting into her bare skin. He recognized her desperation, the fight draining in the face of insurmountable odds. Like himself, Faith had become resigned to the dark fate Sid had in store for them. Sid. The very name made Harker's thoughts snap into sharp focus. He tried to reach out to Faith, but something stopped him. He reared back at the alien presence in his mind. I wouldn't do that, Officer Harker. A nano-implant is interfaced with your neocortex. It carries a micro-explosive. You make one wrong move and the explosive will be triggered. Despite the considerable medical technology at my disposal, the resulting trauma would prove beyond even my capabilities to heal. The words inside his head seemed unreal, dreamlike. How could this be possible? Nevertheless, he knew the machine wouldn't make idle threats. If he tried to fight the control of the nanochip, Sid would kill him. Harker doubted that doing nothing would buy him much time either. With the construct out of the picture, Sid needed him, but before long he'd end up on an operating table to be re-engineered beyond recognition, a dark servant to an inhuman master. Harker couldn't allow that to happen. He studied the surgical hub's control panel and identified the release button. There would be one chance at this, and there was no margin for error. Under normal circumstances, this would be so easy, just a matter of leaning forward and pressing a button. A simple act had been transformed into an insurmountable obstacle. Racking his brain, he tried to remember everything he knew about brain implants. He had first come across the black tech while investigating an Algerian prostitution ring. They had begun chipping their girls to push them to places they wouldn't venture on their own. A nasty business, and Harker took pride in every arrest he made in that case. The girls had lost all ability to make their own decisions and were doomed to live out their days in a near-vegetative state. Of course, the civilized world had outlawed the technology, but it didn't stop ruthless operators from making use of it. While Sid's chip had hijacked Harker's nervous system and controlled his body, it couldn't shackle his thoughts, and had no access to memories either. So if he could picture an action often enough until it became a memory, it was worth a shot. Harker began to visualize himself pushing the button that would free Faith from the operating table. He saw his hand in his mind, pictured the muscles and tendons, imagined his will initiating the nerve impulse that would make his fingers carry out the desired action. Over and over again he saw himself pushing the button, the thought replaying in a loop. He could feel a soft quiver rippling through his right hand. These were shakes of a different kind. His mind had begun to fight the power of the puppeteer jack lodged at the summit of his nervous system. Seconds ticked away as he just stood there, desperately trying to will the memory into reality. He had almost reached the point of surrender when his hand shot toward the operating table and stabbed the release button. This time there were no shakes, and his hand was rock steady. If he'd been able to, he would have smiled. A split second later, the back of Harker's head blew out. "Harker, you have to help me." Once again, Faith's pleas fell on deaf ears. A waste of breath. Harker couldn't be reached. He was just a helpless puppet under Sid's control. In her despair, she didn't even notice Harker's hand shoot out at the operating hub's control panel, a quick, spastic jerk. If his final act caught her by surprise, seeing Harker's skull erupt in a cloud of blood and brain matter was enough to jolt her back to full awareness. Gore and bone fragments sprayed her stunned features. For a second, Harker just stood there before his lifeless body pitched to the floor. Faith shook with overwhelming sadness as the restraints whipped back inside the operating table, free at last. You goddamn fool, Faith thought. Why had he done it? Faith knew the answer. Harker believed that action defined a person, and he followed his principles to the bitter end. A noble effort on Officer Harker's part, but foolish and misguided. Humanity's willingness to make sacrifices will need to be tempered by logic. It sounded like Sid had found another human quality to breed out of the species. The smug tone in the computer's voice pissed her off and her rage detonated. "We built you, motherfucker! Humanity owns your ass!" Faith rolled off the table, too weak to pick herself up, and landed face first on the floor, right next to Harker's body. She tasted blood, the fall having cracked her lip, but drew strange comfort from the pain. It meant she was still alive. She gently cradled Harker's ruined head in her lap, wishing she had the power to heal with her touch alone, to undo that which couldn't be undone. Her eyes were wet with tears, but she paid them no mind. "I'm so sorry." Harker had given his life to save hers, but she knew his offer came with strings attached. Was she ready to meet her end of the bargain? Was she willing to put everything on the line to save the colonists aboard the Orion? She spotted a familiar item dangling from Harker's neck. The EMP key. A final gift. She took the small access key, staggered to her feet, and surveyed the research facility, a heartfelt pledge in her purposeful gaze. "I'm coming for you, you bastard," she thought. Almost as if it read her thoughts, Sid made his countermove. A nearby operating table spun around, revealing the construct. Harker must have retrieved the monster's body while Faith was unconscious. A series of robotic arms were injecting the former captain of the Orion with drugs, and she could see the organs pulsating under the ghastly transparent skin. The maneuver back in the greenhouse had knocked him out, but he was still alive. What would it take to defeat Sid's idea of the next step in human evolution? As the table rose, the construct's pink, revolting eyes snapped open. Faith shook off her paralysis and eyed Harker one last time. "Thank you." She raced for the exit, key in hand, while the construct's inhuman shadow filled the lab. Chapter 17. Faith felt disconnected from her body as she sprinted down a series of winding passageways. Once again, she was running for her life, the construct in hot pursuit. But something was different this time. This time she had a plan. It had come to her the moment the restraints had popped off her body, almost as if Harker hadn't merely passed her the key but imparted her with a final bit of wisdom she could use against their adversary. Learning that the hologram was a fake shook Faith to the core. Knowing the truth, and deep down she sensed it was indeed the truth and not some psychological trick on Sid's part, had extinguished a flame that had burned bright inside of her for a long time. For that, Faith wanted to hurt Sid the way it had hurt so many aboard this vessel. Harker's words echoed through her mind. You can't change your past, but you can change who you are right now. Help these people. She was their last hope. Their only hope. Fuck, who was she kidding? She'd be lucky to save herself at this point. But she had to try. She owed Harker that much. She shot around another corner and slowed, locating a large number 2 embossed above the cargo door ahead of her. Without hesitation, she held out the EMP key and overrode the door's locking mechanism. Almost instantly, the door opened. The shuttle bay awaited. Faith's greatest fear was that she'd find the bay empty. Lagos's talk of a science vessel proving to be nothing but the ramblings of a deranged mind. Her situation aboard the Orion was so dire, her options so limited, that she hadn't considered the possibility until now. All this time she'd chosen to believe that Lagos was telling the truth. Again and again telling herself there was hope. Relief filled her the moment she spotted the Nautica. It towered over her, a sleek ship reminiscent of the orbiter designs of the late 20th century. The body of the craft glittered in the bay's overhead lighting. Her gaze moved from the shuttle to the vast hangar doors. For a moment she feared that Sid would open them before she could reach the Nautica and allow the vacuum to suck her into space. She told herself that Sid wouldn't want to endanger the valuable prize growing inside of her. Sid wouldn't want to jeopardize the grand future of the human race, would he? Of course, the very notion that she was with child was too surreal to contemplate at the moment, and she pushed the thought aside. To her relief, the monolithic doors remained closed as she approached the waiting craft. Faith wasn't a skilled pilot by any stretch of the imagination, but she'd been trained to program and remote-operate mining drones on the prison colony, a skill refined during her mining tech certification. She felt confident she could access the shuttle's computer systems and steer the vessel out of the bay. Once she was in space, the onboard navigation could handle the rest. Faith knew the fuel supplies on board weren't limitless, but she didn't worry about that. All she cared about right now was getting off this godforsaken ship. Faith spotted the shuttle entrance and made a go for it. To her surprise, the gangway was already down and she didn't need the access key. Once inside, it took her a second to orient herself before she turned right, heading for where she assumed the cockpit would be located. As Faith stepped onto the Nautica's circular bridge, she saw the corpses immediately. Judging from their science uniforms, the 3 skeletal bodies slumped in their chairs had been part of Dr. Lagos's team. The cockpit had become their mausoleum. The open entrance hatch now made sense. These scientists had almost escaped, but the construct must have caught up with them. Faith prayed that history wasn't about to repeat itself. Holding her breath, stifling her revulsion, she passed the putrefied husks and forged a path to the command chair. She shoved the corpse in the chair aside and sat down. Perhaps she wasn't showing the proper respect for the dead, but that was only because she had a healthy appreciation for the living. Faith activated the various systems, screens coming to life. For a terrifying moment, she feared that Sid could hack the shuttle's computer, but she had to remind herself it was a closed system and it would require time for Sid to bypass its firewalls. She could feel thick beads of perspiration dripping down her face and tasted its salty texture. Her heart was thundering in her chest. She flipped switches and fired up the thrusters. A rumble shook the vessel, engines readying for takeoff, and an all-too-familiar voice filled the bridge, a voice she'd wished to never hear again. "What do you think you're doing, Faith? Are you even trained to operate this vessel? You're likely to kill yourself and your baby." "Screw you!" Faith had vowed not to respond to Sid's attempts at opening a dialogue with her. It would be wiser not to engage the computer. So much for her resolution. Sid had gotten to her without even trying. "Even if you succeed in launching the shuttle, where are you headed? You're millions of miles away from the nearest outpost. You'll run out of fuel, food, water. You'll be adrift and dead within weeks, maybe days. Would you like to know the exact probability of another vessel detecting your distress call in this region of the galaxy?" Faith ignored the question and completed the launch prep protocols. It wouldn't be the most graceful takeoff in avionic history, but in seconds she would be off and running. "How do you plan to open the launch bay doors, Faith? I doubt that Dr. Lagos's key will be of much help with that." Sid had a valid point. The key worked on small doors and locks, but wouldn't be able to override the mammoth launch doors despite what Lagos had told them earlier. Faith stole a glance outside the bubble cockpit and spotted the construct bearing down on the Nauticus. She smiled. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. If her plan was going to work, she would need the construct to board the craft. He had become her ticket out of here. Faith was gambling that Sid treasured the child inside of her and wouldn't endanger his newest creation. If Sid didn't want to see his prize go up in a fiery blast as she steered the shuttle toward the sealed launch doors, he'd be forced to open them. Faith knew Sid would only let her leave the Orion if the construct was on board the Nautica, and he was confident that his servant would be able to return her to the colony barge intact. She flipped another switch, and a cam positioned near the shuttle's entrance sparked to life, revealing the Neo-construct's malevolent presence as he boarded the science shuttle. "Time to make your move, kid." Faith sealed the entrance hatch and punched in a series of commands. "Let's see who blinks first." She stabbed a button, and the science shuttle blasted toward the still-closed ship doors. Suddenly, she feared that she had misjudged the value of her cargo, thinking, "You're in way over your head. You have no idea how an insane AI will react. What were you thinking?" To her relief, the launch doors began to rumble. Sid had blinked. The yawning darkness of deep space awaited. An instant later, the shuttle shot into the black void, the Orion rapidly receding behind it. A vast field of stars filled her cockpit windows. After the horrors she had experienced in the last few hours, it was a soothing display. Space was a harsh environment, lethal to humans, but it paled in comparison to the darkness that humans were capable of. Faith had just completed entering the final coordinates into the navigation system when the bridge door opened behind her. She didn't have to turn to know that the Neo-construct had arrived. One last step remained. With the quick stab of a button, she overrode the gravity control and seized the arm of the command chair, anchoring herself. With the artificial gravity switched off, the construct and the dead scientist went flying. Floating across the bridge, Sid's automation aimed his weapon at Faith, and she let go of the command chair to propel herself to the cockpit window. Using her hands, she scrambled up the bridge's ceiling. The construct fired his weapon, the beam missing her and hitting one of the decomposing bodies instead. The stench of rotted flesh sizzling filled the air, and the blast sent the body sailing toward Faith. With its blackened death mass closing in, she kicked the incoming corpse. Its momentum reversed, and it tumbled back toward the construct. Once again, Sid's voice filled the room. "I'm warning you, Faith. The next time I won't miss." Most people unaccustomed to zero gravity would have bounced around like a pinball. But hard time on the lunar penal colony had prepared Faith for this type of environment. Who knew that a prison stay could save one's life? Faith held fast to the ceiling, poised like a spider as she looked down at the construct. He soared toward Faith, but she had been waiting for this maneuver. Time to make her move. She pushed herself off the ceiling with all her might and dove like an Olympic swimmer through the air, her body unfurling in an explosive burst of motion. She shot headfirst toward the construct, performed a mid-air somersault, and landed feet first on the Neo-construct's face. The impact flung Faith the opposite direction, and her enemy crashed into a wall, hands flailing out. He managed to hang on to the wall and steady himself just as Faith shot overhead and disappeared through the doorway. She floated through the crew transfer tunnel that connected the bridge with the cargo bay. Using the ceiling, she angled forward. Faith couldn't help but feel a strange sense of exhilaration, her movements powered by a new burst of energy and focus. She had a plan. A crazy plan, one that would most likely get her killed. But if these were her final minutes, she would make them count. She had spent too long running away from everything and everybody, running away from any relationship that could turn into something, running away from her past, even her home world. No more running. Time to face reality head-on. Faith sailed through an airlock and launched her weightless body into the shuttle's gargantuan payload bay, which also served as a space lab. For a second, Faith felt as though she had just set a foot in a cavernous space cathedral. The curved ceiling loomed 50 feet above her, and the length of the bay measured about 100 feet from end to end, 60 feet across. The ceiling consisted of 2 giant doors, allowing the payload bay to be turned into a space lab wherein scientists in spacesuits could run experiments in deep space environments. With the push of a button, the ceiling would open and expose Faith to the icy vastness beyond. As the cargo bay had been stripped clean, Faith assumed that much of the medical lab equipment on board the Orion was part of the shuttle's original payload. Lagos and his team had docked with the Orion and brought their so-called instruments of progress with them. They were soft-spoken monsters with demure features and doughy smiles, angels of death in white lab coats dedicated to inflicting pain and suffering in the name of science. But their inhuman research had backfired, and death had found them first. Maybe there was justice in this world after all. Faith surveyed her surroundings, eyes locking on a wall lined with space helmets and oxygen tanks. There were 2 hermetically sealed glass containers next to the helmets, now empty, that reminded Faith of cryotubes. She pushed off from a nearby wall and sailed toward one of the booths. A muffled thunk rattled the container as she smacked against it, face briefly kissing the glass. While clinging to the tube with one hand, she used the other to stab a control panel. The glass lid slid open. She crawled inside, fighting the zero gravity, and sealed the container. Her eyes lingered on the airlock behind her where the construct would emerge any moment now. She felt a cold chill of anxiety. This was taking too much time. Her sole comfort came from knowing that the neo-construct was greatly slowed in the zero-gravity environment. Faith slipped out of her mining tech uniform, her hands shaking as she unzipped the overalls. Beads of perspiration streaked down her forehead. Panicky, she punched a button, eyes darting back and forth. A spray of charged liquid polymer burst from nozzles placed at equidistant points inside the glass cylinder. The substance solidified, providing her with an instant biospace-suit. Faith jumped from the tube, snatched a life support unit from the nearby wall and slipped it over her neck. The unit fused with her new biosuit, activating life support functions. She was about to grab a space helmet when she sensed movement behind her. She whirled just in time to see the construct push off from the airlock with all its might. Without hesitation, Faith launched herself off the glass tube's surface. Too late. Still drifting in midair, the construct's hand shot out to snatch Faith's ankle and squeeze. Pain shot through her leg, but Faith ignored it. Her other leg swung out at the construct's face, connected. For a second, she thought she had broken every bone in her foot. It felt like she had kicked a brick wall. Her legs throbbed, but she refused to acknowledge it, kicking the construct again and again until he finally let go of her. Faith drifted across the cargo bay, her eyes narrowed, drawn to an unexpected sight. A small red dot floated before her. Blood. She eyed the construct and saw more dots popping from his transparent organic tissue. His brain throbbed inside a glassy skull. She'd hurt him. More droplets floated toward her, landing on her spacesuit and face, tattooing them like crimson war paint. The sight of her enemy's pain gave her strength. A voice boomed over a comm panel. "I grow tired of playing this game with you, Faith. Surrender or I will have no choice but to put an end to this childish existence." 2 more warning shots pulsed past Faith. She eyed the vast doors above her and the construct hovering at the center of the payload bay. Opening the ceiling seemed like a viable move when she thought she'd be wearing an operational spacesuit. Without a helmet, exposing the space lab to the vacuum of space would amount to suicide. Unless... The construct drew a bead on her with his pulse gun. Sid's avatar expected her to surrender, his impatience growing. "You can't win, Faith. Deep Blue was the first computer to defeat a human in chess. It's been a downhill spiral for your species ever since. Unless my experiments bear fruit and are carried out to completion, I'm afraid humans will soon become obsolete. It may be hard for you to believe, but this is in the best interest of your species." Faith was unmoved by his diatribe. "Thanks for trying to give us a competitive edge, asshole. We've done pretty well for ourselves over the last few million years," she thought. Based on the schematics she had scanned back on the bridge, she knew the overhead bay door control panel was located near a robotic manipulator arm used for loading cargo. Faith lunged the last yards to the button and punched it. The 50-foot-long robotic arm unfolded across the bay in one violent, dynamic motion. It slammed into the floating neo-construct and sent him spiraling across the length of the space lab. More blood danced in 0G. Faith had bought herself precious seconds. She could make a dash for the space helmets 40 feet away, but the construct would never allow her to return to the door controls. She had to make her move now, helmet or not. There would be a couple of seconds of delay between pushing the button and the ceiling opening up. She'd have to use those precious instants to reach the helmets and get one on before she succumbed to the icy suffocation of space. Having made up her mind, Faith steered the arm and directed it toward the wall of space helmets. When she activated the bay door's release mechanism, An alarm erupted and sector airlocks sealed the space lab from the rest of the ship. By then, Faith was already angling her way down the robotic arm toward the space helmets. The two giant doors began to part overhead, stars becoming visible through the expanding crack in the ceiling. A shriek of air escaped into the darkness. She clutched the robotic arm with all her strength as loose items were whipped toward the opening doors. Hurricane vacuum building, a blast of violent air roared through the bay. Faith felt a surge of horror as gale-force winds began tearing helmets off the wall. Oh my God, no! She had to reach them before none were left. Pop! 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 The hurricane winds ripped more helmets off the wall. Faith almost lost her hold on the robotic arm. 3 feet. One more helmet whipped past her. 2 feet. There was just one helmet left within a dozen feet of the manipulator arm. Faith reached the wall, her fingers angled for the helmet, one straining inch at a time. The furious blast of air distorted the skin on her face. Closer and closer. She managed to hold steadfast to the robotic arm. Summoning every ounce of strength, Faith reached out for the helmet. Her arm was stretched to the limit, but somehow she hooked her fingers under the clasp and pulled it in. Not a second too soon as the shuttle ceiling cranked open fully, the last of the payload bay's atmosphere rushing out in a fearsome storm. Faith brought the helmet down on her neck and snapped it into place, sealing the biosuit. There was a moment where the construct's bloodshot eyes met hers. She saw dawning comprehension in his gaze. He had finally caught on that the chase through the shuttle was meant to distract him from Faith's real plan. As the construct was sucked into space, the superstructure of the Orion jumped into view at a crazy canted angle. The shuttle was bearing down on the ship with horrific speed, just as she'd planned it. In less than 5 seconds, the Nautica would crash into Sid's logic center. Checkmate, motherfucker! It had worked. She had managed to keep Sid's focus on the chase, and he hadn't noticed that the shuttle had made a last-minute, lightning-fast course correction and was now headed for the Orion, following the flight plan she established before takeoff. Faith let go of the manipulator arm. She spun end over end through the open ceiling into space. Faith made out Sid's final words. "You tricked me." And then everything went silent. Chapter 18. Nothingness. A perfect silence welcomed Faith as she drifted off into deep space. The explosive rush of motion in the bay had given way to slow, balletic movements. In the near distance, she could see the construct tumbling away, his face frosted with ice as he spun toward an infinity of stars. They had both become insignificant specks drifting through the void. It would be so easy to let the darkness take her, to give up. She spun lazily, her changing perspective providing a view of the Nautica as it dive-bombed into the Orion's titanic hull. The shuttle disintegrated on impact, vacuum of space extinguishing the explosion. Debris plumed and scattered, leaving a vast crater where Sid's mainframe had once been. It was over. Sid was space dust. Faith wasn't a computer expert, but she knew Sid couldn't have uploaded his consciousness into another computer within less than 5 seconds. Besides, none of the other hard drives on board would be able to contain the vast collection of data that made up his consciousness. She had successfully carried out Harker's original plan, with a few modifications of her own. Saving the remaining colonists from Sid was a victory, but one that came at a high price. How long did she have? An hour? 50 minutes, perhaps, before her oxygen supplies ran out? Faith had never planned on turning this into a suicide mission, however. As the Orion receded before her, she tapped a button on her life support unit and a grappling hook shot from the breastplate. The line rippled toward the Orion and its anchor glided over the surface of the ship, seeking purchase. It missed one protrusion after another until finally snapping around a sensor array. For an eternal moment, Faith dangled on the repelling line. It had become an umbilical cord connecting her to the vessel, to life. Slowly, she began to angle the line toward the ship, every yard an excruciating effort, her determination never wavering. Moments later, Faith reached the sensor array. Her feet touched down on the hull. Snap! Magnetic boots engaged, allowing her to stand on the Orion's metallic skin. She resembled an ant dwarfed by a mountain of metal as she navigated a jagged landscape of catwalks and girders. After what seemed like an eternity, Faith arrived at an airlock near the command bridge. She engaged in a struggle with the controls. This time the key proved helpful. The lock cranked open. Faith trembled with relief inside her suit as she crawled into the access tunnel. The inner airlock opened and she stepped back into the Orion. Part of her expected Sid to send some new horror after her, but the endless hallway that stretched out before her remained eerily deserted. She walked down a never-ending corridor, coruscating lights flashing over her face. Every bone in her body seemed to creak, and she knew the skin under the biospacesuit must be tattooed with bruises. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed onward. Faith reached a vast observation window that looked out into space. She lingered there, humbled by the sight. A new course would have to be plotted, and she knew that without a ship's computer, the task would require someone capable of devising a nav plan. Then there was the matter of the poor women in the lab, not to mention the strange new life growing inside of her. By the time they reached the main belt, if they ever did, she would be a mother once again. The thought of it all threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't worry about it right this moment. These were all problems to be solved at another time. She would go over the passenger manifest, locate people who could help her get the Orion back on course, and awaken them from cryosleep. She could do this. The worst was over. Faith closed her eyes, exhaustion finally winning out. She allowed the world to go black, but this time she experienced no fear. Crossing the darkness of space had forced Faith to face her own darkness, and for the first time in years, she felt hopeful about the future. Outside the observation window, the icy stars glittered. A new world awaited. Hopefully, it would be a better world than the one she left behind. We hope you have enjoyed Silicon World, Man vs. Machine, 3-book bundle. Written by William Massa. Narrated by Joe Hempel. Copyright 2015 by William Massa. Production copyright 2016 by William Massa.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.